What's up, everybody? This is John from Coding Addict, and welcome to the first Node.js project video, Task Manager API. If you watched my Node.js and Express tutorial video, this is the first project of the second part of the series. Now, initially, the idea for the second part was to make a big API, but after careful consideration, I decided to split it up in 4 or 5 smaller apps, since that has worked really well in my React series. And of course, it goes without saying, complete the small apps first and only then work on the big API. Since that way, by the time we start working on the big API project, you'll be at least familiar with all the building blocks of large API. Before we tour the app, let me just mention a few things. First, my assumption is that you have watched the tutorial part, since we'll right away dive into the database setup. So if you're still iffy on things like modules and basic express route setup, it's probably going to make a bit more sense to complete tutorial video first. Second, even though the app might look basic, remember that it's our first API, and the goal is to get us familiar with persisting data on the database. And only once we're comfortable with that, then we can move on to more complex topics like advanced queries, auth, complex validation, and multi-part error handling. Also, during the project, we're not going to work on the front end. It's just there so you can see how our responses are consumed by the front end app. So essentially, how the API is used in real life. Since that way, at least in my opinion, you get a bigger picture, not just a Postman results. Don't get me wrong, Postman is awesome, and we'll definitely use it during the project. But whenever I'll feel that it's necessary, I'll also whip up the front end so you get the entire picture. As far as the app, we've got a task manager where we can create, read, delete, and modify tasks. And again, let me repeat, the whole deal is that all our data is on a database, not in a local storage or in some random array on our server. As far as the bare bones functionality, it goes something like this, where of course I can read all the tasks. I can create a new one. So in here, I can say new task, I submit, and of course we do that by sending a post request. Then we have option of removing the task. And if we want, we can navigate to a separate page where we get info only about that one specific task. And if we want, we can edit. So in here, I can go with old task and I edit the data. And of course, now I can go back to all the tasks and I can see that it is completed and the text is different as well. And once we know what we're going to be building, now let's get to work. In order to follow along with the video, you'll need a starter project, and you can get one at johnsmilga.com. Again, the URL is www.johnsmilga.com. Look for the project, more specifically Node and Express one, and both of these links go to the same repo. So just click on any of them and then just get hold of the repo. So in my case, I think I'm going to go with clone option. So I'm back in my terminal. I'll zoom in. We're going to go with CD desktop. So I'll set it up on a desktop. And then, of course, I go with git clone and then copy and paste the URL. And once you get the repo, then let me showcase what you'll find inside. So I'll drag and drop. And in here, you'll find the Node tutorial that we worked on, the Express tutorial, and of course, the Task Manager. And more specifically, in the Task Manager, you'll find the final folder. So this is a complete source code. However, there's one gotcha that I want to talk about where you will need a database connection string in order to spin it up. So don't just go there and then run npm install and then npm start and then get mad if the project doesn't start up. So essentially, in order for everything to work, you need to set up .env file and in there set up a variable by the name of Mongo URI and set it equal to connection string. And of course, I'm going to cover that later on in the videos. So that's about final. And as far as the starter, if you watch the tutorial part, this should look very familiar. So essentially, in the public one, we have the front-end application. Again, not something we're going to work on. We're going to work on a backend, but since I want to showcase how everything is going to look with a real app, that's why you have there the public folder. And as a side note, if you're interested in just HTML and CSS, you can actually find the same exact project in my HTML and CSS course. And then also we have git ignore. So essentially in this file, we say which files are going to be ignored by the source control. And I'll talk about it a bit more when we're setting up the .env file. Then we have app.js with straight up console log. And then in the package.json, you'll find all our dependencies, which at the moment are .env, express, and mongoose. Now, of course, in tutorial, we only got familiar with express, but as we progress with the project, of course, I'll cover the other two as well. And in order to have a smooth development process, I also set up nodemon as a dev dependency, and then the command to start it up is npm start. That should do it for the setup, and I think now we're ready to start working on a project. And once we're familiar with the setup, let's kick things into gear and actually start working on a project. And the first thing that you need to do is to navigate to the starter folder. Again, you're looking for the third project, the task manager, and then more specifically, the starter folder. And I think the fastest way to navigate there is by just typing cd and then grab the starter folder and drop it here. And then once you're in the starter, before you do anything, make sure that you install all the packages. And of course, we do that by running npm install. And then once all the packages are in place, in order to spin up the nodemon, we need to go with npm start. Unless, of course, you want to change it to a different command. If that's the case, then make the changes and then use that command instead. So in my case, I'll just wait a little bit. I mean, it shouldn't take too long. There's not that many packages in there. And then once I have all the packages in place, then of course, like I said, we're going to go with npm start. And if you see task manager in the console, we are in good shape. And now let's set up the most basic express server, which essentially is just going to be listening for one route /hello, and it's going to be on port 3000. Now, if you want to jog your memory and test it up yourself, just pause the video and resume once you're done. If you don't want to do that, just keep on watching the video. And the way we set up the most basic express server is by setting up a variable by the name of express. Then we'll set it equal to require, and that's going to be equal to our express package. Then we need to initialize it. So we go with app, and that is equal to express, and we invoke it. And then, unlike the previous examples, we'll actually set up a variable by the name of port. And for time being, we'll hard code this to 3000, but eventually there's going to be more code. And I'll talk about the reasoning later. So for now, just set up the variable and we'll be in good shape. And in here, we need to go with app.listen, of course. And first thing we pass in is the port. And the second is the console log. So we go here with some kind of text. And I'm going to go with server is listening on port. And then, of course, we pass in the port value. And I always like to add those 3 dots as well. So I'll do it in this case. And then I'll open up my console. The moment I have server is listening on port 3000, which is just awesome. So now let's also set up that one lonely route. So above the port, I'm going to go with my comment routes, and then we'll just say app.get. So this is going to be a get request. Now, what is going to be the URL? Well, we'll go with / and hello. So that's going to be the path. And then, of course, we have the callback function once the user hits the route, and we're looking for rec and res, so request and response. And we simply want to go with res.send, and then we'll pass task, manager, and app. So I'll save it here. I'll navigate to the browser, and I'm looking for port 3000, of course. And then we'll go with hello. And if we see task, manager, app displayed in the browser, then of course we are off to the great start. Beautiful. And once we have the bones in place, next, let's take a look at our application so we can decide what routes eventually we're going to have. And I can see that I'm getting all my tasks. So there will definitely be a get request that gets me all my items. Now I can also create a new task. So there will be a post request that can create a new task. Now we can also delete one. So there will be a route for that. And if we click on edit, we open up a new page. And in here, we get info about a specific route. So there will be a get request that just gets me info about one single task. And also, we'll have the ability to edit. So if I change the completed from true to false, and if I successfully edit that, then if I go back to the tasks, of course, in here, I don't see the check mark, which means that I successfully edited the task. And what that means is that there's also a route for the update. And in summary, our routes are going to look something like this, where there will be a get request on API version 1 and then tasks. So this will get all the tasks. Then there will be a post request on API version 1 tasks. Again, the same URL, however, the method is different. So totally different functionality. In this case, we'll create a new task. And then we have get route with params. So with the ID of the task that gets us that single task. And of course, one for update and one for delete. And since there's a lot to unpack over here, I'll spend the next video on the reasons behind such API structure. All right, so let's go step by step. And probably your first question is, well, why do we go here with /API and then version 1? And essentially, that is just a convention. We need to understand that on the server, we also might have different routes, not just the routes for the API. So, for example, you could be serving a index page here on a /, meaning there could be a nice index HTML page that you're serving up over here. And then also on the same server, you have the API routes. So convention is effectively just to signal that all of these are the API routes. Now, as far as the version, well, as you're setting up the API, eventually you might want to change some things. So it's easier if you have this version, because that way, when you create a new one, then you can just direct everybody to API and then version 2, 3, or whatever. And while we're still on that same note, why don't we navigate to a Hacker News one, the one that I showed you previously with Algolia, and you'll notice exactly the same setup, where essentially they go with domain and then / and then API and then version number 1. And that leads me to my next point, where if you're ever in doubt or if you're just interested on different setups, just check out the different APIs. There's tons of APIs out there, and you can just look for one, then take a look at their setup, and then decide if what they're doing makes sense to you. Then, of course, you can implement in your project. If not, then just move on to a different API, and eventually you'll find a setup that makes the most sense to you. After that, you're probably wondering, okay, I understand the API and then version. That kind of makes sense, but why do we go here with get and then tasks? Then we have the post and the same tasks, and then for get, patch, and delete, we go to the tasks, but then we're looking for the colon. Why isn't this written in a different way, where we're just looking for a single task or something along those lines? And to give you a short answer, that is a convention. But since there's more to it, I want to actually cover that in a few videos. So I want to set up the basic routes with just some simple responses. Then I want to open up the Postman and do a little bit of setup over there. And then right before we start setting up the database, I actually want to spend one video on just talking about the convention. And then lastly, if you remember, in tutorial, we worked with put, and now for the update, we're using patch. And I know that this might be a little bit frustrating to you, but that's also going to be something that we will cover a bit later once we have already a working application, because that way I believe that I can give you a solid example of the differences between the put and patch. That's about it for the general route structure. So now let's start implementing it. Not bad, not bad. I think we're good with the general structure. So now let's start implementing it. And I want to right away set up the router as well as the controllers. And if you remember at the very end of the Express tutorial, I covered why is that necessary. And essentially the short answer is that as our application grows bigger, it's not going to be very sustainable if we'll just start dumping everything in the app.js. And for the time being, I just want to create this one route. Now, as far as the response, it's just going to be a simple string that says, hey, here are all the items or something along those lines. And then once we have that one in place, then we'll add the rest of them and then we'll test it out in the Postman. So let's get cracking. And I'm going to go with new folder. So here will be all the controllers. And in this case, I'm going to be looking for the tasks. And I also want to set up a routes folder. So in the routes folder, we'll go with new file and same thing. We're going to go with tasks.js. And then as far as the setup in the routes, we need to look for the express router. So say const express, and that is equal to require. And then again, we'll look for express. And this should be a refresher because we did cover that at the end of the express tutorial. So just to jog your memory, if we go back to express tutorial, and then more specifically, we'll look for the final one, the file 13, the router people shows a basic router example. And essentially we have two options. We can either go with router get and then add all the controllers one by one, or we can actually chain them together where we go with a router and then use a route. So this is going to be the main route, in our case, API version 1, and then tasks. And then we chain get and post. And I think I'm going to go with this setup. So first, let's start by setting up the router. And that is equal to express and then router. We invoke it. And then eventually we'll import controllers. But for now, of course, we don't have any. So let's just leave that one blank. And we'll go with router, then route, like I said, then /, and then I want to go with get method. And for time being, I'll just hard code the response over here. So say rec and res dot and send. And like I said, we'll just start simply. So say all items. Now let's save that one. And then all the way in the bottom, we want to go with module exports, and that is equal to our router. So now back in the app.js, we want to import the router, we want to import our tasks, and we want to set up the middleware. So in here, let's just go with const and then routes, and that is equal to require. And then, like I said, we're going to be looking in the routes folder, and then more specifically, we're looking for the tasks. And then right after this hello, and don't worry, we'll change that one a little bit later. For time being, it can just stay the way it is. We'll go with app.use. And then, of course, what route are we looking for? Well, we want to go with API, then version 1, and then tasks. So that's going to be that root route for the tasks router. And then we just want to go with our routes. And you know what? Let's just change it around. My bad. For some reason, I went with the routes. Let's just call it tasks. I believe it's going to make a bit more sense. And since we'll be sending JSON from our application, for example, when we're creating a new task, and since I want to access that data in my routes, what we need to do, of course, is get middleware that is built into Express. And that middleware is express.json. So above the routes, we'll go here, and I'll try to spell this correctly, since that is always an issue. Hopefully this is correct, middleware. And then we'll just go with app.use, and eventually we'll set up the static one as well. But since at the moment we have barely any routes, I'm just going to go with express and JSON. If you remember, if we don't use this, then we won't have that data in rec.body. So I'll save it here, and I'll leave the comments. just so we all are on the same page. And before I test it out in the browser, let me just double check. So I'm using the middleware where I'm saying that I'm looking for API version 1 and then tasks. And then I pass in my router, my tasks router. And then in the router, effectively, I have this root path, which just matches whatever I pass over here. So again, I go with API version 1 and then tasks. And then I set up a get route where I manually pass in my controller. And in here, I just say res.send and I pass in a string of all items. And it looks about right. So let me go here and we're going to go with localhost 3000 since it's a get request. Of course, we can access it. Again, API version 1 and then tasks. And we should see a string of all items. And if we do, then of course, we're heading in the right direction. So the last thing that I want to do in this video is to first close my Express tutorial one. And then in the controllers, we want to create a new file and we'll call this tasks.js. And again, just to jog your memory, the whole deal why we're setting up separate routes and separate controllers, because if I'll try to jam everything in app.js, it's going to get messy pretty fast. So what I want to do right now is take this logic and place it in a separate file, because eventually, of course, there will be way more logic than just res.send. So I'm going to go to my controllers and effectively I want to create my function, the controller function, and I'm just going to go with const get all and then tasks, and I'll set it up as an R function. I'm looking for rec and res, and functionality will be exactly the same, res.send, and we're just going to go with all and then items, and then we're going to go with module exports. And since I'm going to add more functions in here, I'll right away export it as an object. So say get all tasks, that's when I'm exporting, and then back in the routes, of course, I want to access it. So I'll say here that I wanted the structure get all tasks from, and of course, we need to require it. And in this case, we're looking in the controllers. So I'm going to go 2 levels up. I'm looking for controllers and then more specifically task. So instead of hard coding this value, of course, I'll just pass it in and I'll say get all tasks. And if I go back to my URL and if I can still see all items, then of course we are in good shape. And let me just test it out where I'll change this around and I'll say all items from the file. And then if we go back, yep, we still have the correct result. And with this in place, now we can set up the same basic structure for the rest of the routes as well. Beautiful. And in the same fashion, let's set up the rest of the controllers. So we have the get one. Now I want to create one for the post, one for get, but that's going to be a single item. Then we also have one for patch and one for delete. And pretty much in all of them, the setup is going to be exactly the same as far as functionality. I'll just send back and I'll say what the controller is doing. Since, of course, we haven't connected to the database or anything like that. And I just need to come up with a name. In my case, I'm going to go with create task. And again, we have rec and res. And then we want to copy and paste since I want to speed this up. And I'll just say create task. Create task. And why don't we change this one around? And we'll say get all tasks. Now we want to copy and paste. And we'll have 3 more. We'll have one for getting the task. So get task. And here we'll say get single task. Then we'll have one for updating. And that's exactly how we'll call it. We'll say update task. And the same is going to be over here. And then the last one, of course, will be delete and then task. And you guessed it, we also need to change the text. And now, of course, we want to place that in the same object. So let's go with create task, then get task. Then we have update task. And last one is delete task. And then back in the routes, of course, we want to import them. So say here, create task, get task, then update task, and delete one. And now we just need to set up the routes. If we take a look at the app.js, these two, the get and post, are going to go to API version 1 and then tasks. And then the rest of them are going to be with the ID params. So same initial path, but then we'll just add the / and then ID. And that's, of course, is where we're going to pass the ID of the task. So where I have the get request to get all the tasks, I'll chain dot post. And of course, which controller are we going to use? Of course, the create task one. And then we can simply go to the next line and we'll go with router, then route. And like I said, we'll go with / and then ID. And then we're looking for get route. And that will be equal to get the single task. Then we'll set up our patch, and that will be equal to update task. And then lastly, we have delete one, and that will be equal to delete task. Now, since we know that we can only really test the single task and get all tasks, because that's the default method the browser performs, we'll stop over here. And in the next video, we'll spin up the Postman to quickly test all of our routes. Because trust me, you don't want to go any further without knowing that at least the basic setup works. Because you can set up whatever logic you have over here. If there's a small bug and you cannot access these strings, then you'll spend way more time later searching for that bug. Nice job. And once we have the basic structure for all of our routes, now let's test them out in the Postman. So I'm gonna head back to my desktop. I'm looking for the Postman. And since in this case we'll spend way more time over here, I also want to cover some configuration options. So for starters, I want to switch to a dark mode because I think you'll appreciate that more. So if you want to do that as well, just go to the cog and then you're looking for the settings here. And then in the settings, just look for the themes. And of course, we have a dark theme as well. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. Then we want to create a collection. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, since we'll be setting up multiple routes and they will reference the same application, it's just going to be easier as we create more and more applications. And in order to create that collection, we go here and click on creating the collection. And for starters, I just want to change the name. So I'll click on these three dots over here. And of course, we're looking for rename. And then I'm just going to go with 03 and we'll call this task manager. Now, if you're not happy with this name, of course, pick your own one. And once I have the task manager, then we want to start by creating a request. So we create a new request. It's going to be a get request. And instead of typing all the time manually here, local and then host, and we're going to go with 3000 and then of course API version 1 and then tasks. What we want to do is set up a global variable. Now, there's multiple ways how we can do that. You can actually set up the environment. So think of this as a dev environment and then you can have production environment. But in our case, we'll just set up this local host and then 3000 and then API and version 1 simply as a variable. And you can do it from here. As you can see, they even give you a suggestion and all that. But I'm just going to go the long route where we click here on that I. And then notice I have already one for the URL. I have localhost 3000. And then I actually changed it later to / API. So now what I want to do, I want to showcase how we can remove it. So if I go over here and if I remove it and I set up a new one, in this case, again, I'll call this URL. And then as far as this value, well, I'm just going to take this whole thing. So I'm going to go with localhost and then 3000. And of course, we're looking for API. And if you want, you can also include the tasks. But in my case, I'll stop right after the version 1. So let's copy that one. Again, I'm setting this up as a global, but you can set it up in the environment as well. And then once we add that, should be able to right away access it. So now, of course, we just need to save it. And then in order to use it, we need to go back. And you know what? I'll remove everything for now. And if we go with these double curlies, this is going to give us access to those variables. And all the way in the bottom, we have the URL. And of course, as you can see, it is global. So in here, I'm going to go with URL. I'll close it. And then I'll go with / and then tasks. And once I save, I should get back get all tasks. And of course, that means that our basic setup works. And before we continue and do the same thing with the rest of the tasks, now, of course, we want to save it. And not only we want to save it, we want to save it in our collection. So let's click over here, save as, and let's give it a more meaningful name. And in this case, again, I'll say get all tasks. And of course, we're looking for task manager. So this is going to be saved in this collection. And we simply click on save. So if I take a look at my task manager, now, of course, I have get all tasks where we use the global variable and we can successfully see our string. And now I'll close a few of these tabs because it's getting quite busy. And let's do the same thing for the rest of them. So in this case, I'm going to be testing the create one, the one for the post. That's why we need to change the method. That's the first thing you want to do. Then we'll go with our URL. Again, we'll close it out / and then tasks. And remember, now we want to send some data, correct? Now, we're not doing anything with that data on a server, but just for the kicks, why don't we send it? I'm going to go here with body. Then we're looking for the raw. And of course, we're not looking for text. We're looking for the JSON. We just need to make sure that we use the correct syntax. And in this case, I'll say name, and that will be equal to testing. And we just click on send. And if we can see create task, we are in good shape. Now, since I also want to test out whether my middleware is working, I'm going to go back to my controllers. I'm looking for create task. And in here, instead of just going with send, we're going to go with JSON. So now I'll be sending back the JSON and I'll pass in reg.body. So if you want, of course, you can console log it on a server, but in my case, I think it's going to be faster if I just send back whatever I'm getting from the client. So if we go back and if we change this around and we'll say here, shake and bake. And if we add a comma and then completed, we set to true. Once we send, that should be our response. And of course, the only thing that's left to do as far as the create route is go to save as, and then we'll say create task. Save it. And now let's continue. Again, I'll close these ones just so it's not that busy. And in this case, I want to go with get route. Then we want to go here with the URL again. And of course, we haven't set up the database, so there's no real ID, but we can definitely test it out if we just go with tasks and then whatever gibberish. So in this case, I'm going to go with hello. So that's going to be my ID. So we're not sending anything as far as data, but we are using the params. Again, if we take a look at the routes, we can clearly see that we have / and then ID. That is going to be our param. And if we want to test it out, where we have get task, of course, we have the request and the ID is sitting in the params. So in here, I'll do the same thing. I'll say JSON and we'll just say ID. And that one is equal to rec, params, and the ID. So if we save here and then go back and just use the get route and click send, we have the key with the name of ID. And then the value is hello. So if we'll change it around and if we'll say Peter, of course, the value will be Peter. Again, same spiel. We go with save as, and we'll name this update task, or I'm sorry, get single task. My apologies, get single task. We'll save it. And then we have two more. We have one for update and one for remove. And in order to speed this up, I don't think I'm going to do any testing anymore. We simply want to open up a new route. We want to go with patch in this case. And again, we're going with URL and then / tasks, whatever value you want to pass in over here. So I'm going to go with 1, 2, 3, send. And of course, I have update task. Beautiful. Let's save that one. And we'll write here update and task. And the last one, of course, is delete. So let's close these two. And again, new request. We're looking for delete method. The URL is going to be exactly the same. And then we want to go with / tasks and then any of the IDs that we have already used, since we'll change that later anyway. And once we send, the response should be delete the task. Now, if you don't want to go with save as, you can simply click on Command S. That's going to be a shortcut. And we go here with delete and then task. And of course, we save it in the same task manager. And once we can clearly see that we can access all our routes correctly, then we can move on to our next topic. Okay. And once we're done with the Postman, before we start setting up our database, let's quickly talk about our routes. More specifically, why we use such structure. Long story short, it's because we're building a REST API. And since these days, the term API is used pretty much for everything, let's just all agree that in our case, since we're building a server, essentially we want to create a HTTP interface. So the other apps, most likely front-end ones, can interact with our data. That's how we view API in this scenario. And when it comes to REST, it stands for Representational State Transfer, and arguably it's the most popular API design pattern. And essentially, it's a pattern that combines HTTP verbs, route paths, and our resources, aka data. So effectively, REST determines how the API looks like. Now, let me emphasize something. It's a pattern, not a strictly enforced set of rules. So nothing stops you from setting your own API in totally different manner. In fact, if you have used APIs on your front-end apps, you know that some of them have totally different structure. I guess the best advice I can give you is this: whatever pattern you decide on, stick with it. Or in other words, be consistent. Otherwise, it's just going to be very confusing for your users. And this is a common approach where you have the main list. So that could be orders, that could be customers, that could be items, whatever. And of course, in our case, it is tasks. And in order to get all the items, we go with get method. And then if we want to create one, it's going to be the same endpoint, but we just go with different method. And of course, in this case, it is post. And not to be redundant, we already discussed this before, but just because they have the same URL, the same endpoint, since the methods are different, in this case, we have get, and of course, in the second scenario, we have post. These are two totally different requests. Please keep that in mind. And then for individual item, you have the same path pretty much. So you have API and then tasks, orders, customers, or whatever. And then you just use the params to point to that one specific item. And then if you want to get the item, then of course it is a get method. For update, you'll use put or patch. And then to delete one, you'll use the delete method instead. And since JSON is a common format for receiving and sending data in REST API, we'll use that approach as well. So even though at the moment we use send method in our routes, eventually we'll switch to JSON method instead. Also, I would like to point out that REST in general is somewhat fuzzy. In fact, oftentimes you'll deviate away from straight up REST since that's what the setup will require. One more thing, you can probably notice something. Essentially, our API allows our user to perform a CRUD operations on our data, and CRUD stands for create, read, update, and destroy. And it's a common approach where the API interface is built around CRUD, since those are usually or typically operations that users or apps want to perform on a given data, whether it is, again, users, orders, customers, or in our case, of course, it is going to be a task. And we'll return to CRUD a little later when I can actually show you how it relates to our data. Lastly, there's obviously more to REST, and some of that we will discuss in later projects. But since I'm not a big fan of long slide videos, and I believe we covered all the major points, we'll stop right here and move on to our database setup. If you remember in Express tutorial, the route setup was extremely similar to that we have right now, with one big caveat. We used basic array to store some list of items on our server. And based on the request, we performed some kind of operation on the list and then send back the response. And of course, that is not very serious approach to store our data. And therefore, starting with this project, we'll set up and connect to a proper database. And pretty much for the remainder of the course, we'll use NoSQL or non-relational database by the name of MongoDB. Now, I'm not going to dwell on differences between non-relational and relational databases, as well as pros and cons for each of them. But the major difference is that unlike traditional database, where we have rows and columns, in MongoDB, we can simply store everything as JSON. And basically, it doesn't care how the data relates to each other. Instead of tables, we have collections, which represent a group of items. And instead of rows, we have documents, which represent single item. And a document is a set of key value pairs. And as far as data types, we can use strings, numbers, arrays, objects, and many more. It's very easy to get started. And even though you can set it up on your local machine as well, we'll right away go for cloud option, since that's something you'll probably end up doing anyway. We'll use MongoDB Atlas, which is a official option. Basically, it's created by the same people who created MongoDB. And since they offer generous free tier, you'll just have to create an account and you'll be good to go. And once we're familiar with MongoDB, let's set up and configure MongoDB Atlas so we can host and manage our data in the cloud. I have the account already, but since I want to cover all the steps in detail, I'll set up another dummy account together. And remember, we can set up the entire thing for free. So don't worry, your credit card can stay nicely tucked away in your wallet. If you get stuck or confused in any of the steps we're about to take, here's an awesome resource you can use. Just Google create MongoDB Atlas and follow this link, which actually brings us to official docs. And here you'll find a checklist, which we're going to use as our roadmap for the following few videos. And what is the first thing they want us to do? Create a new account. So let's do this, people. I'm going to open this up in new tab. And then, of course, you can find a bunch of useful info in here, yada, yada, yada. You keep on scrolling. And I actually want to navigate to a login page. And I'm just going to pretend that I don't have the account. And we're going to go for sign up. And in here, of course, you just need to provide all the necessary info. And once you have filled everything out, and as a side note, don't worry, this is not my real phone number. Then, of course, just click on sign up. And up next, they're going to ask for organization and project name. And in my case, I'm going to go with Node and Express course. Then I'll pick JavaScript. We'll click on continue. And we probably can actually skip this, but let's just leave it there. And up next, they want us to set up the cluster. Now, if you take a look at the checklist, actually cluster is already second step. So let's go back here. And pretty much you always want to shoot for the free one, unless, of course, you want to start paying them. So in here, we'll just go with create cluster. That's going to be the free one. Then it's using AWS. Okay, awesome. As far as region, I'm going to go with this one. Then we have cluster tier and additional settings, and we'll leave them both as default. And lastly, I just want to change the name. And I think I'm going to go with Node, Express, and Project. And once we're done, we just need to click on Create Cluster, and we'll get ourselves a new cluster. Now, as you can see over here, they say that it's going to take a little bit of time, which is usually the case. So I'll stop the video here, and I'll see you next one where we'll continue with our steps. And once our cluster is ready to go, before we start messing around with data, so with collections and documents and all that, there's a few things that I want to do first. And I'm going to start by setting up the database access. So effectively in here, we'll set who can access our database. Now, I'm not talking about the Atlas account. No, I'm talking about the database and collections we're about to set up. And we simply need to click on add new database user. And we're going to go with password. And if you get some default values, just wipe them clean. And I'll simply go with John. And as far as the password, I'm just going to go with 1234. Please, please, please do not do that in your own setup. The only reason why I'm doing that because you'll be able to see my password anyway. And don't worry, once I'm done setting up this project, of course, I will change my password. So it's not going to be 1234. And once you're done with the user and password, notice we have database user privileges. And this user can read and write to any database. So I'll leave it the way it is. And we'll add a new user. That's good. I'll close this one. And then we want to set up the network access. So we want to set up from where we can access our database. And you can already imagine that, of course, once we deploy the project, then, of course, we'll set up that IP address. But for the time being, while we work locally, we might as well set up access from anywhere. Now, if you want, you can set up your own IP address here. So you can just add the current one. But in my case, I'm going to go with allow access from anywhere. And I'll just click on confirm. And lastly, I want to get the connection string that we're going to use once we connect our database to our application. And in here, what you're looking for is connect. So you want to go back to the cluster, then connect, and then you want to go with connect your application. So not the Compass one, not the Mongo shell, actually the second one here, connect your application. And then I'm going to go with 3.6 or later. That's about right. And then you just want to copy this one and then navigate back to our project. Now, eventually we'll set it up as the environment variable. Yes, that's going to be the case. But for the time being, I'll simply create a new folder in the starter and I'll call this DB. And then inside of the DB, there's going to be a new file and we'll call this connect.js. And then I want to create a new variable and I'll call this connection string and I'll set it equal to that value. Now we'll have to add some values over here, but we'll do that later once we're actually ready to connect our application to the database. So just take the string, copy and paste, set it up in the DB and then connect.js. And now we can start exploring the Atlas setup. And once we have set up database access, network access, as well as the connection string, now let's actually explore the data part. And we want to click on collections. Then we're going to go with our own data. And then we need to come up with a database name. Now, the first one will be a dummy one. And of course, once we connect to our application, then we'll create a task manager one. So the first one I'll just call store. And then they ask us to create a collection. And don't worry, I'll cover what actually are collections and all that. But for the time being, I'm just going to go with product. And then we'll create one. And once we have everything in place, we are ready to start creating documents. So whenever we talk about MongoDB, we'll have the database. So that essentially is going to be that application. Again, in our case, eventually, this will be the task manager one. And then inside of that database, we'll have collections. Now, if you're familiar with regular databases, you can think of them as tables. And in our collections, we'll have a group of MongoDB documents. So if I name my one products, you can probably already guess that here I'll have list of products. And if I'll decide that my store will also have users, of course, I can go here and create a new collection. And as a quick side note, we won't have to do this manually. I'm just showing you the general setup manually. Of course, eventually, all of this is going to happen automatically once we connect from our task manager. So I have a list of products. And then, of course, I can also create a list of users or list of orders. And hopefully you get the gist. And once we have our list, now let's talk about the individual items. So I can go to any of my collections, and then once I'm here, I can insert a document. And document in MongoDB effectively represents that one single item. And what's really cool that just like JavaScript object, effectively it's a set of key value pairs. Now, by default, the moment we create a new document, we'll get this underscore ID, which is going to be that unique ID. So we don't need to worry about the IDs. And then, of course, we need to set up a type. So what is going to be the type for our document? What is going to be the type for the item? And if you click over here, as you can see, these are our options. We can set it up as an array, binary, Boolean, and yada, yada, yada. And I'm purposely not going to spend too much time on types, since eventually we'll set it up from our server anyway. And at that point, the setup is going to be a bit different, since we'll use a tool called Mongoose. Now, in our case, what are we looking for? Well, we're just looking for the string. I'm just going to go here with name, and then I'll set it equal as first and product. So here, of course, I can insert. And now not only I have the product collection, but I also have my first item, my first document. And here comes the biggest gotcha. In MongoDB, documents have a dynamic schema. And what that means in plain English is the simple fact that documents in the same collection don't need to have the same set of fields or the structure. So if I were to go to insert document, and instead of string, I'm going to go with array, and I'm going to call this colors, and then I'll set my first one to be red, then second one blue. And if I'll save it, as far as MongoDB is concerned, there's still the same items in this products collection. So nothing stops you from doing that. Now, just because you can does not mean you should. And therefore, we will use additional library by the name of Mongoose, which will set up that structure for us. But as far as straight up MongoDB, yes, both of these documents are still part of this products collection, even though their structure might be totally different. A few videos ago, while discussing REST, I mentioned CRUD. Create, read, update, and destroy or delete. And now I want to quickly show you how is that going to look like with our current manual setup. I fully understand that some parts might look really silly, especially the read one, but in my opinion, it's important that we start with the basics. And hopefully that way we'll have a better understanding of overall principles when we need to implement CRUD in our REST API. So what does CRUD means in our manual setup? Well, first, we want to create an item, correct? So in here, we just find any of the collections. And in this case, I'm going to stick with product since I already have some items over here. And then we simply go with insert document. And again, we just come up with a type and then some kind of value. And in my case, I think I'm going to go with another name and I'll just leave it as a string. And I'll say test CRUD. I'll insert the document and I'm done. So we're done with the first part where we created an item. Now the second one, reading them. Well, we simply stare at the screen and we can see that we have 3 items. So I can see that I have 3 products. Again, in our application, that just means that we'll be able to read the documents that we have in our database. When we're working with GUI, it's very straightforward where you're just staring at the screen. Then we want to update them. And then with the manual approach, we just look for this little pencil and we say that we want to change some values around here. So in here, I could go with another item and I'll say green. So now, of course, I have successfully updated the array as well. And you know what? Let's also add one more and I'll call this orange. Then I update and I'm done with that part as well. So not only we can create, read, but we can also update. And then the last one, delete. Well, we simply look for another icon. In this case, we're looking for the trash icon. So we just click here. And now, of course, we remove the item. So that's the basic approach of CRUD in our manual setup. All right. And once our database is ready to go, now we need to connect to it from our server. And we can definitely use the native MongoDB driver. And I believe the package name was just that, MongoDB. But a very popular alternative is to use package by the name of Mongoose instead, which is a object data modeling library. And essentially the reason why it's so popular and why we're going to use it in this and rest of our projects is because right out of the box, it comes with a bunch of goodies that make our development faster. Now, I'm not going to list them in this video since you'll see them in action in all of our projects. Just let me repeat that yes, you can set up your apps with just native MongoDB package. But the reason Mongoose is so popular is because it has extremely straightforward API and it basically does all the heavy lifting for us. When it comes to our project, I already installed Mongoose, so we can start using it right away. But if you want to use Mongoose in your own future projects, the command is npm install and Mongoose. And one last thing, in this project, we're going to be using Mongoose version 5 something. So if by the time you're watching this, and if they have a higher version, pretty much everything starting from 6. So if you have 5 point, I don't know, 14, 15 or whatever, you'll be still in good shape. But if by the time you're watching this, they already have version 6, their API might also be different. And at that point, you have two options. Install this particular Mongoose version, or just use the latest one and utilize their docs. All right. And once we're familiar with Mongoose, let's kick it up a notch and finally start using our database on our server. And the first thing we need to do is to set up a connection. And at least a basic setup is going to look something like this, where we're going to import Mongoose. And of course, we're going to do that in Connect.js. So I'm looking for the DB folder, and then more specifically for Connect.js. And then here at the top, above the connection string, I'm going to go with const Mongoose. That's the name of my instance. And then that is equal to require. And of course, I'm looking for the Mongoose. And once I have the instance, then the method name is connect. So we go here with mongoose.connect. And the first thing we want to pass in is the connection string. But if you remember, I said that we'll have to make some changes. Take a look. So this is going to be my username, correct? But then what is the value for the password? Of course, that is some dummy value. So in here, we need to pass in our actual password. So in my case, of course, that is 1, 2, 3, 4. But I strongly suggest using more secure one for your application. And then here at the very end, we have my first database. So this is what they set up by default. And that's going to be the name for the database if I don't change it. And you're probably wondering, well, wait a minute. I mean, we didn't set this up on the Atlas. So why it's here? You see, if it's not going to be there, it's going to be created for you. So here you have two options. Either you can just go with this one, or in my case, I'm going to remove it. And again, just make sure that you don't remove more than you should. So you want to remove everything starting with a / all the way to the question mark. And in here, of course, you need to come up with a name. And in my case, I'm going to go with the same name as my application. So since I have 0.1 for no tutorial and then task manager is 0.3, that's exactly what I'm going to set up over here. So I'm going to go with 0.3, then hyphen, and I think I'm going to go uppercase. So I'm going to go with 0.3 task and manager. Again, this is going to be the database name. And if you haven't created that database already, they will create for you. And once we add these changes, our connection string is ready to go. So now we simply need to pass in as a first argument. Now, the second argument is going to be options. And effectively, this is where we'll pass in some values just to avoid some deprecation warnings. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a second. But for the time being, we'll just leave it empty. And then this returns a promise. So we simply can go with .then. And since I want to see whether I'm successful as far as the connection, I'll just pass in a callback function. And I'll say log. And of course, I'll remove the semicolon. And I'll say connected to the DB. ... And then since there might be an error as well, we also want to go with catch. And of course, we'll just be looking for the error. So we have our callback function, and I'll say error, and we'll simply console log the error. So we'll say here, console log, and I'm going to be looking for the error. And once we save, nothing happens. And the reason why nothing happens is because we're not executing this function yet. But if you remember, during tutorial, one of the first things that I covered is the fact that if we have a function in a module where the function is effectively executed there and then, we only need to import, meaning require the module, and we'll right away execute the function. So I simply want to navigate to app.js, and then this is just temporary because we will change the setup around this one. We won't leave it this way. I just want to get the connection up and running. And therefore, I'm just going to go to app.js, and then we go with require. And notice I'm not assigning this to any kind of variable. Simply go with require. Then we look in the DB, and then more specifically, we're looking for the connect. And once you save, you'll have tons of deprecation warnings. And don't worry, we'll fix them in a second. But all the way on the bottom, if everything is correct over here, if you passed in the correct password and you grab the correct connection string, then you should see connected to the database. And if I want to test out the error, I'll simply remove the 4, since I know that that is going to be a wrong password. So once I save now, of course, I'll have this error. So I'm just going to keep on scrolling, and notice here, it's going to say Atlas error. And of course, I already know why, because my password is correct. And if we'll take a look at our graphical interface in the Atlas, once we refresh, we're not going to see any changes. Because again, we haven't set up any kind of logic. So you're looking at it, you're like, okay, I still have one database. What's happening? Don't worry. Once we start adding the items, that database will be created for us. In my case, 0.3 task manager. And even though I will refactor this in the next video, because there's some gotchas that I want to talk about, before we do that, I'll show you how we can remove those deprecation warnings in a console. And if you remember, we just need to pass in the second argument, which is going to be an object. And in here, we just need to pass in following key value pairs. And we'll start with use new URL parser, and we'll set it equal to true. Then we'll look for use create index. We'll set that one equal to true. And then we'll go with use find and modify. That one will be false. And then lastly, we want to go with use unified topology, and that one will set equal to true. So once I save, now I don't have any of those warnings. I simply see server is listening on port 3000, and then I have connected to the database. And if that is also something that you see in a console, you are in good shape, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Nice. We have successfully connected to the database, and life is great. But before we start messing around with the data, there's something that's bugging me. And it's simply the fact that our server and database connection don't work in sync. Now, what do I mean? Well, let's take a look at the console. So first, I have console log that our server is listening on port 3000, and only then we're connecting to the database. But if we think about it, what is really a use for our server if we are not connected to the database? Whatever we're about to do is going to fail anyway. So what I'm trying to say is, wouldn't it make more sense if we try to connect to the database, and only if we're successful, then we spin up the server? If not, well, then we'll just kill the application. And in order to do that, we need to restructure our code a bit, where I'm not going to invoke Mongoose Connect in the Connect.js. I'll refactor the code, and I'll set it up as a function, and instead we will invoke it in the app.js. And in order to do that, we'll just remove this dot then and catch. Now options, of course, stay. We're not doing anything with that. And here, let's create a function. We'll say connect and db, and that is equal to our function. So essentially, we're setting up the arrow function, and eventually we'll set up the env variable, and effectively we'll pass it from the app.js. And therefore, I'll add the parameter here, the URL. For the time being, we won't use it. We'll do the same thing what we did before, where we just passed in the connection string. That's coming up in next video. And then I want to grab this Mongoose Connect, cut it out, and then from this connect DB, I just want to return that result. So effectively what we're returning a promise, correct? And then all the way in the bottom, we're going to go with module and export. So now, of course, we want to export it. And what we want to export, of course, connect and DB. So once we have this setup, then we'll just have server is listening on port 3000, because now, of course, we want to assign it to some kind of variable. And again, the order is really up to you, but I'm just going to put it below the tasks. So I'll just move it over here below the tasks, and I'll say that that is equal to connect DB. So effectively, I'm just getting that function over here, and I'll set it equal to the required one. And then once I have access to the function, then all the way in the bottom, I want to set up one more function by the name of start. And in this function, we will invoke connect DB, and then only if we're successful, then we'll spin up the server. So let's go somewhere here in the bottom, and we'll say const start. Again, we'll use the arrow function. And since I know that my connect DB returns a promise, correct? I can set this function as a sync, and that way, of course, we can use the await keyword. And every time we have a synchronous operation, it's very useful to set it in the try catch block, so that way, if there is an error, we can handle it as well. And in the try block, we'll pass in await. So since I know that it returns a promise, I'll use my await keyword. Then I'm going to go with connect DB. Again, eventually we'll pass in the string coming from the env file. For the time being, we just have hard coded in the connect.js. And then only if we're successful, then we'll spin up the server. So I'll move this line of code right below the connect DB. And again, we'll just spin up the server if the connection is successful. If not, we're going to go with console log, and then we'll just look for the error. So once we save, nothing happens. We don't spin up the server because, of course, now we have a function. So all the way in the bottom, I'm just going to go with start, and then you'll notice that there's a console log for the server. Now, of course, we don't have the console log for the connection because we removed that in connect.js. But if you really want to test it out, again, go back over here and just mess with your password, and you'll right away see that we'll get that error in console. And in here it says bad auth, authentication fail. So we know that our setup works. So if, of course, we will have a wrong password, then we won't be successful. However, if everything goes smoothly, then we should see that our server is listening on port 3000. Not bad, not bad. We have set up the connection, we have refactored the code, and we're almost ready to start tinkering with the data. But there's one last thing that I want to do first, and that is simply setting up the .env file. Now, why we would want to do that? Well, let's think about it. Eventually, we might push this up to the GitHub, correct? And what do you think is going to happen the moment I push this up to the GitHub? Of course, everyone who takes a look at my repo can nicely grab the string and then tamper with my data. And how we can avoid that? Well, the solution is to set up .env file where we can keep our secrets. And then in our application, we'll have to use a package by the name of .env. And of course, I already installed it for you. And then we'll be able to access those secret variables anywhere in our application. And once we push this up to the GitHub, if we add gitignore, so .gitignore file, and then in here we specifically say which files we want to ignore, and make sure that you add .env. Now I also added node modules because that is a common practice since that folder is so big. But as far as keeping secrets, make sure that not only you set up .env and of course use the package because otherwise you won't be able to access the variables, but always the moment you set up .env, also set up .gitignore. And that way we'll just push this up to the GitHub, and then .env will be ignored. So when people come and see your repo, they won't see this secret connection string. So let's start here by creating .env. And in my case, I'm going to do that in the root. So I also suggest you do the same. So I'm going to go to the starter. I'm looking for a new file, and I'm going to go with dot and then env. And in here, we have, again, key value pairs. However, we don't need to use the quotation marks. And I think I'm going to go with Mongo and then URI in this case. So I'm not going to go with long name, the connection string. And then you simply want to take this value. So cut it out from the connect.js, go back to .env, set it equal to my Mongo URI, and then where I have connect.js, I can simply remove it. And then remember, when we were setting up the function, I said that I'm going to be looking for the parameter, but of course, initially we were not using it. Now, of course, I want to use it. So I'll remove the hard-coded connection string, and I'll say URL, and we'll just save. Now, there's going to be an error. Don't worry, because of course, we're not passing that connection string. Notice over here, we have the parameter blah, blah, blah is undefined. Okay, that was expected. Now what we want to do is go to the app.js, since over here we invoke start, and then we want to pass in that value from the .env into the connect DB. And in order for us to access those secret variables, we simply need to require that package. So I'm going to go below connect DB, and we'll just say require. And notice how we don't have to assign it to any kind of variable. We just go with .env. Again, that's the package name. And as a side note, if you want to install, you just go with npm install and then the package name .env. Pretty self-explanatory. And then you want to use process.env and then whatever is the variable name. So let me save my .env and then back in the app.js. Once we require, we just want to go with dot and config. So essentially, we just want to invoke the config. So now if we keep on scrolling where we have the connect DB, we want to go with process.env. And remember, that was one of those global variables. We go with .env, and then we go with Mongo or whatever the name for your variable is. In my case, that is Mongo URI, and we'll save it. And of course, we're back in business because I have server is listening on port 3000. Again, very, very important. If you want to keep your secret variables actually secret, set up the .env, get the package, and you'll be able to access them anywhere in your application by using process.env and then whatever is the name of the variable. Beautiful. And once our connection string is a env variable, now let's set up the structure for our future documents and assign them to the collection. And we're going to do that using schema and model from the Mongoose. And the way it's going to look like, we're going to go to our starter and we'll create yet another folder. And in this case, we'll call this models. And then inside of the models, we'll create a new file and we'll call this task.js. So I'm going to go here with task.js, and then the setup is going to be following, where again, we import Mongoose and we set it equal to require, and then Mongoose, of course. And then we're looking for mongoose.schema. So we set up a new variable and I'll call this task schema, and that is equal to new. So we're using the constructor and we go with new mongoose and schema. And you're probably wondering, okay, what on earth is happening? Well, if you remember, when we were setting up the Atlas manually, one of the first things that I mentioned is the fact that for our document, there is no set structure. But that's exactly what I want. Where for my tasks, I only want the name, which is going to be a string, and a completed property, which is going to be a Boolean. Because you would have to agree that it's not going to make much sense if somewhere in my tasks, I'll have an array with the color values, correct? So therefore, we go here, we go with Mongoose schema, and using schema, we'll set up the structure for all the documents that eventually we'll have in our collection. And the syntax is following, where again, we use key value pairs, and eventually we'll set them equal to an object and we'll pass in more options. But since I just want to get something quickly in our database, we'll just start quick and dirty, where essentially I want to come up with a key. In my case, again, that is going to be name and completed. So those are going to be the two keys, and I'll just set up the types. So that is a bare minimum, where you go with the key name and then the actual schema type. So what type of data this is going to be. And if you're interested on what options we have, just navigate to Mongoose official docs and then look for schema types. Keep on scrolling. And then, of course, you can see string, number, and yada, yada, yada. So I'm going to navigate back and I'll say name. So that's going to be my first key. And I'll just set it equal to string, then comma. And of course, I'm looking for completed. Completed, that is going to be my second key. And that will be set equal to Boolean. Again, bare bones setup, we'll do more complicated a little bit later. And then once we have the schema, so essentially once we have the structure for the data, now we want to set up that model. And think of model as a representation for the collection. So these guys are sticking in the product. So now, of course, we'll create tasks collection, and then all the tasks that we're about to push into our database, of course, will be added to that specific collection. And what's even more cool, in Mongoose, a model is a wrapper for the schema. So if the schema defines the structure for the document, like the type, validations, and etc., a Mongoose model provides an interface to the database. So using the model, we'll be able to create, update, query, and delete our documents with great ease, since the API is extremely straightforward. And you'll see what I mean in the upcoming videos. And we do that by creating a model, and we right away export. So I'll go with module.exports, and that is equal to Mongoose, then model, and then model is looking for two things. It is looking for the name, and then we want to pass in the schema. So in here, I'm going to go with task and then comma. And of course, this is the schema that I want to pass in. So say here, task schema. And once we're done with this, the only thing we need to do is go to our controllers and start using our model. Beautiful. We have set up our first schema as well as the model. And of course, we want to start using it. And yes, we will use it in the controllers. Therefore, we'll navigate there, and I'm going to be looking for my model, and I'll assign it to the task variable. I'll say require. I'm looking in the models folder, and then more specifically, task. And then before we continue, let me just give you a brief overview of what we're about to do. So if we navigate back to Mongoose docs, and more specifically, if you're looking for the models, we can find here more info. You can see that models are fancy constructors compiled from schema definitions. An instance of a model is called a document. And then they give you this example, pretty much everything that we did in the last video, apart from the fact that, of course, they have different values. And here we have nice explanation that the first argument is singular name of the collection your model is for, since Mongoose automatically looks for the plural, lowercase version of your model name. So effectively, eventually, we'll have the tasks. Then they mention one more time that the instance of the model is called document. And there are a few ways how we can create one. We can go this route, or we can use .create. And in here, they showcase the callback function approach, but we can also use await. And essentially what create is looking for, well, it's looking for the object with those properties. So in our case, we have name as well as the completed, correct? And of course, we can pass this manually, but wouldn't it make more sense if we just go to create task route? And since we know that in there, we can access the task data in the request.body, why don't we just pipe it through and pass it along to our model create method? And it's going to work something like this, where I'll grab the body. Of course, it's going to be coming from my Postman here, shake and bake, and the value will be true. And then instead of sending it back, we'll pass it into task.create. Now, since I'm going to be using await on a task.create, of course, I want to refactor this. And I'll say that this function, the create task, actually is going to be async. So my controller will be async. And then instead of the function body, I'm going to go with task, and I'll set it equal to await. Like I said, I'm not going to use the callback function approach. I'll use await instead, and we'll await for task.create. And like I said, if you want, you can hard code this here. You can say name and then first task. And of course, we can do the same thing for completed, but I already covered why it's going to make way more sense if we just take this rec.body, so whatever we're getting from the Postman, and then let's just pass that object into task.create. And let's see what happens. So I'll remove it here, and I'll just say rec.body over here. And as far as the response, well, now I'm just waiting for that task. So instead of rec.body in the response, I'll place my task. And I also want to add the status. And if you remember, the correct status was 201. Effectively, that is if you have a successful post request. And then instead of JSON being equal to rec.body, we'll pass in the object. And in here, we'll pass in our task. And then once we save, again, nothing happens because we haven't triggered the post request. But if we go back to the Postman, and if I click here, send, what I should see is this. I should see the task. So that's my object. And now check it out. We have this underscore ID. And what that means? Well, that means that we created a new document with the following properties. We have name, we have completed, we of course have the ID, like I just mentioned, and we also have this underscore v. So of course, these two are created by default every time we create the document, and then these ones we provided. So if you want to keep on testing, we're going to go with second task, and we'll set maybe the completed to false. Again, this is all quick and dirty just because I want to have some data in my database. There will be still some modifications to the code, but if we can see these successful responses where we have tasks with underscore ID, what that also means, my friends, is that when we go to our database and if I refresh, check it out. Now, of course, I have the task manager. Like I said, that's my database. And what do you know? Of course, I have the tasks collection. Now, what do I have in task collection? I have documents. What documents? Shake and bake and second task. And if you have the same result, congrats, we're off to the great start. Nice. At this point, we can successfully create new tasks and persist them in our cloud database. So now it's really just about applying the same concepts to the rest of our routes. But before we set up the rest of the 4 controllers in a similar fashion, there are a few important things that I want to cover first. For starters, I just want to showcase that since we set up our schema, only the properties that we specified in our schema will be passed on to the database. And everything else is going to be ignored. Don't believe me? Let's try it out. First, I just want to showcase that in our schema, we specified 2 properties. Name and completed. So now if I go back to the Postman and I'll just set up testing schema, that's going to be my name, testing schema. I'll leave completed as false, but if I try to add some properties that are not on my schema, effectively they will be just ignored. So in my case, I'm just going to say random is equal to random. Now I do still need to use the proper JSON syntax, and then I'll just add the amount and I'll set it equal to 5. Now you can add 10,000 properties, and again, the result is going to be exactly the same. So I'll just leave these two and we'll try to send it. So here I send, and then check it out. Now what I get back is only the name and only the completed. Again, let me repeat, only the properties that you set in your schema will be passed on to the database. Everything else will be ignored, which of course is really, really cool, because that way we can avoid this mess where, if you remember back in the store when I was setting up the products, one has name, the other one has the colors, because there is no structure for these documents. When we use schema, there is a structure. So whatever we set up in the schema is going to be passed on to the database, and whatever comes as an extra is just going to be ignored. All right. And once we've got that out of the way, next I want to talk about validation. You see, even though we only accept the properties that are specified in the schema, our current setup has one big doozy. There is no validation. So essentially, we can pass in empty values. How is that going to look like? Well, again, we can go back to the Postman. And in the first example, I'll just remove completed, and I'll pass in the name as an empty string. Now, I do need to fix this comma here, but you'll see that actually we're successful. So I can create item this way. And what's even more interesting is that I can send an empty object and I'll still be successful. And you have to agree that actually this is not the best setup, correct? So that way we can just set up a bunch of empty items. Now, what can we do about it? Well, we can add the validation to our schema. Now, before we continue though, let me just say that when it comes to validation, since it's a pretty big topic, we'll just be scratching the surface. The plan is to show you more features as we progress with the upcoming projects, since I have a feeling that if we'll spend the next hour or two on just validation, understandably, a lot of you will lose interest and attention. Don't worry though, at the end of the video, I will show you where you can get more info. So at the moment, we have a very minimal setup where we have properties and we just specify the type. However, we can set up our properties as objects, and then we can also set up built-in validators. How is that going to look like? Well, I'll remove the string part from the name, and then I'll set it equal to an object. I'll add a comma, of course, since I need to keep the proper syntax. And in here, the first property we want to set up is type. Now, it's still going to be a string, but now, of course, we can add more validators. Now, what validators can we use? For starters, we can go with required. So what this is going to do is if I pass in the value, the object, without my name property, then it's going to spit back big fat error. Now, at the very basic level, you can set up equal to true or false. Either it is required or not. But if you want a custom message, you can actually set it equal to an array, where you go with the first value, again, true or false, and then you add a comma, and then you pass in that custom message. And in my case, I'm going to go with must provide and name. Now, what else I can do? Well, I can trim. So imagine the scenario in a Postman. If I go here with name, and if I pass in here spaces and then John, effectively with our current setup, that's exactly how we'll save it in our database. And if I don't want that, I can simply go back where we have the object, and then the property that you're looking for is trim, and we'll set it equal to true. And what's also really nifty that for strings, we can get min values or max values. And in my case, since I don't want my value to be bigger than 20 characters, for the name one, I can go with max, and the property that we're looking for is length. Make sure that you spelled correctly. This is always a doozy for me when it comes to length. And again, we'll set it equal to an array. And I'll say that the value for my string is going to be 20. And then in here, we'll just go with name, cannot be more than, and of course, we'll set it equal to 20 and then characters. And essentially, we're done with basic validators for the name. Because like I already mentioned, I really just want to scratch the surface. So you get the main idea. And then as we're progressing with the project, then of course we'll implement more features. And I want to do the same thing for completed, where I'm not going to go with required. Hopefully this is clear, and you'll see in a second what kind of error we have if we don't pass the name. But for the completed, I just want to show you that we can also set some default values. And again, we want to remove this Boolean, and we're going to go with type. We'll set it equal to Boolean. And then as far as the default value, the property is simply default. And as far as default in this case, for the task property completed, I think it's going to make most sense if we'll set it equal to false. Again, just to showcase how is that going to look like in a real project. So as I'm adding the task, new task, by default, it's not going to be completed. And only when we navigate to a specific task page and I say, yep, it's completed, now we can edit. And then, of course, we can navigate back to all the tasks. This was just my setup. Of course, there's a million different ways how you can do that. But that's why in here, when I'm setting up my validators, I set my completed one to be equal to false. So now, of course, we can save it and we can test it out. So I'm going to navigate back to my setup here in a Postman. And as you can see, completed is still not required. And that is done on purpose. So essentially, I already set this up as default false. So I don't want to set it up as required. Therefore, we don't need to pass it here, but I just want to see how it nicely is going to trim and how we also will get errors if we don't pass in any values. So in here, let me just try with the John, and notice once we send, we actually get trimmed value back, and completed is set to false right away. Okay, that's an awesome start. But notice what happens if we send an empty string. So let me remove all the values. Let me click on send, and now check it out. So we have here this sending request. And the reason why we're not getting anything back, because we have big fat error in our console. We have validation error. And there's few things that we need to understand about this error. First, it is caused in a task schema because we finally set up the validator and we set it equal to true. And of course, we're sending empty string. So that's the same thing as if I were to send completely empty object over here. So if I cancel it and if I send it again, notice again, we're not getting the response. That's point number one. Number two, if you take a look at the console, you see that we have this unhandled promise rejection. And this error is originated, blah, 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 blah. And long story short, it is caused in our create task because we have a wait keyword. However, we're not handling this gracefully. We don't have the try catch block where we set up the await in the try. And if there's an error, then of course we do something about it. And since this video is already getting quite long, I'll actually do that in the next one. So just put this one on ice, and then in next video, we'll set up a proper response. And just to recap, as far as basic validation, we just need to set our property equal to an object. Then we need to set up still the type. And in our case, that was the string. And then we can go with the required. If we want to have a custom message, then we just set it equal to an array. And the first item is going to be the value, whether that's true or false for required. And then the second one will be the custom message. Then for the string, we can also use trim. And that's just going to make sure that we don't have any white space. And you can probably already guess that there's one for the min length as well. And in a completed one, we covered how we can add a default value as well. So for this one, we set it equal to false. And if one of our validations is going to fail, then of course we won't be successful of adding that item. And like promised, if you want to learn more about validation, just head on over to Mongoose Docs. So navigate here, and then you're looking for the validation. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of info here. So if your idea of good time is scouring through the docs, you won't be disappointed. Not bad, not bad. I think we have good general understanding of the basic validation in Mongoose. So now let's switch gears and talk about how we can handle it more gracefully. Because at the moment, well, we're just leaving our user hanging, correct? So if the user sends some kind of request with incorrect data, then of course we have the error here on the server. But as you can see, the user is just hanging. And probably it's not the best approach. And again, the whole reason for that is because we have a synchronous operation. However, we're not handling if there is an error. And the fix is following, where we want to go with try catch, and then we want to place our await in the try block. And I'll also right away set up my response. So if we are successful, I still want to send back the response with our task document, the one that we're getting back from the model. And then the second thing, if there is an error, what do? Well, we could also send back the response. And in this case, the status is going to be 500. And effectively, that is just a general server error. And as a side note, I'm purposely using just a general server error status code, the 500 one, since we'll discuss errors in greater detail later in the project. And then we can go with a JSON, and I'll set up the message property, and I'll set it equal to my error. So now if we save, and if I go back, and if I send one more time, you'll notice that instead of hanging, we actually get a response. And in here, I can see that the status is 500. So it's definitely our response. And at this point in time, you probably have two questions. First, do we really need to wrap all our logic in every controller in try and catch? Since I can give you a hint that in the remaining controllers, we'll also use the functions and we'll stick await in front of them. And the short answer is yes. For the time being, we'll have to do that. But then eventually, by the end of the project, I'll show you multiple ways how we can simplify that and how we can omit this boilerplate code for try and catch. Then your next question probably is, okay, we get the response, but this error seems a bit lengthy. Can we make it shorter? And my answer again is yes, we can. And the most basic approach is going to look something like this. Instead of setting message property equal to an error parameter, just simply set it equal to generic there was an error string value. As far as more complex setup, I'll discuss it at the end of the project since I want to keep moving along with the rest of the functionality. As far as my setup, I will keep sending this giant object since that way I can show exact error messages we're getting. And as far as our API, I think we're actually in pretty good shape where we can create a task. We do have some basic validations. And if there is any kind of error, well, we simply send back 500 that there is a server error and we send back error message. Yes, quite long one, but at least it's better than leaving the user hanging. And if we want to try out the max length, I can simply go here with name and then I'll just add some gibberish just so it's more than 20 characters. So let me type it out here. And then once I save, again, we get the error message where we have name cannot be more than 20 characters. That should do it for this video. And now we're ready to move on to our next topic. And once we're done discussing the validation as well as the need for try and catch, since we have a synchronous operation, why don't we continue with our controllers? And up next, I want to work on get all tasks. So we know already how we can create a task. We know that we have a model. In the model, we pass in the schema. And then in order to get the instance, we go with the name of the model. And of course, the method name is .create. Now, what about the rest of the CRUD operations? And again, we'll use our best helper, the Mongoose docs. And if we navigate there, and then if we look for queries, then we can have this nice text where it says Mongoose models provide several static helper functions for, and this should be already familiar, CRUD operations. And each of these functions returns a Mongoose query object. Now, we'll work with query object way more in the next project. But for time being, we just need to understand that on every model, we have these methods that we can use, starting with delete many all the way to update one. And the one that we want to use right now is this one, the find one. And I'll just open this up in a separate tab. And then we can see that as far as the parameter, we want to pass in the filter object. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that if I'll leave this filter object empty, this is just going to get me all the documents. So in our case, this is just going to get us all the tasks. Now, if we start supplying the values, for example, in our case, we could say completed equal to true. Of course, that is going to get us what? That is going to get us only the documents that are completed. Again, the way I've set up the projects, the next project, the second project, is the one where we'll take a deep dive into the filtering, sorting, and all that. For time being, we just need to understand that if we want to get all the documents, which is going to be in our case, for the GetAllTasks controller, we simply need to use find. Now, what's also really interesting is the fact that if we go back and if we keep on scrolling, we can read that a query also has .then function and thus can be used a promise. Now, there is a caveat where technically it's not returning a promise. That's why I say here used as a promise. And essentially what that means for us is that, yes, we can use await. So for simplicity, we can stick await in front of it and we'll be in good shape. However, if you keep on scrolling, you'll read that queries are not promises. And there are situations where it's really important. But if we keep on reading here, they have that then function for async await as a convenience. So long story short, similarly to how we created the task with await and we set up try and catch block, we'll do it here as well. And the way we'll do that, we'll go with try catch. So in here, of course, there's going to be an error. But if we're successful, then of course, we'll just send back all the tasks. So let's start here with const and I'll set it equal to the tasks and the value will be equal to await. So we'll use await keyword. Therefore, in front of the function, I want to set up my async and then I want to go with task. So that's going to be the name of the model. And then the static function name is find. And since I want to get all the documents in the task collection, therefore, I'll just stick here a empty object. And then as far as the error, well, I'll just simplify this. Well, in order to speed this up, I'll just copy the error from the create task and pass it here as well. And now the only thing is missing is our response if we're successful. What do we want to do? Well, we want to go with res dot, and then we're looking for the status. In this case, the status is going to be 200, and then JSON. And in here, I'll just say tasks. So I'll be sending back the object, and then inside of that object, there's a property by the name of tasks. And as far as the value, it's going to be equal to whatever I'm getting back from the find. And I'm just using the 6 shorthand, where if the property name is exactly the same as the variable for the value, well, we can omit the second part. And effectively, it's the same as if I were to write like this. So we have tasks equal to tasks, and then with ES6, we can just shorten this up. And once we save, and if we go back to the Postman, and you know what, let me fix this one. I'll say here properly, I'll say testing task, because I want to save that create one. So I'll save it here. So it stays as our request and I'll close it. And then if we go to all the tasks and we simply hit send, now what we should see is, of course, our object. And check it out. Now we have all the tasks. So we have our array, and then inside of that array, we have items. Of course, each item is represented as an object. So successfully, we have set up the second route as well for all the tasks. And here we use the find static function and we pass in the empty object, which just gets us all the documents in the collection. And in our case, of course, those are our tasks. And then if we're successful, if there was no error, we just go with res.status. So we set up the status for a response and we send back a JSON, and I just jam all my tasks. Awesome. And once we have set up the controllers for create task and get all tasks, next I want to work on get task. And effectively in our application, that route provides info about specific task. So in here, I can see all the tasks. I can create one, of course, but if I want to edit it, I'm going to click on edit button and then notice how I'm getting the info about this specific task. Now, of course, normally you wouldn't share the ID, but in this case, I just wanted to provide more info. So not just the name, but also an ID. So that way you can clearly see that this info is just about this task. And similarly, I can go to the next one. And again, I'll get the ID, I'll get the name, and whether it's completed or not. Now, in this video, of course, we won't set up the edit, but at least we'll get that specific info. And in general, the setup is going to be pretty similar to the one we have with GetAllTasks. However, we'll also have to implement a specific response if the ID that we pass in doesn't match any of the tasks that we currently have. And in order to get up and running, we'll navigate back to the docs, to the Mongoose docs. And in this case, we're looking for the find one static helper function. Just like we used find, in this case, we're looking for find one. Open up a new browser window. And then notice, as far as the parameters, we go with conditions. So we pass in conditions object, and they're very helpful here, where they say, find one adventure whose country is Croatia, otherwise null. So essentially, we use await just for convenience. We have our model, then we have find one, and then we pass in the object. And in that object, we set up what? Well, we set up the condition. And in this case, they look for the country. In our case, of course, we will look for the task and we'll use the ID. So I'll say, get me the task whose ID is equal to whatever I'm getting from the params. Otherwise, we'll get back null. So let's navigate back. I'm looking for get task. And remember, in here, of course, I'm getting that params ID. And before we type anything here in the controller, I just want to set it correctly, my ID. Because, of course, initially, well, I was just passing here to Peter. But, of course, that's not the case anymore. And since I want to use the ID that I'm getting back from the Mongo, I'm going to go to all the tasks. I'll run it. Of course, I get my list. Awesome. And then pick any of the tasks. Doesn't really matter which one. Just look for the ID. Copy this one. And then go back to the single task. And then, of course, instead of Peter, pass in the ID and send. And if you get back the ID key with this value, with that long string value, which is an ID, then, of course, we're in good shape. And I'm doing this just so we don't have to console log here on the server. You can definitely do so, but I just think that it's more convenient for us to see those logs here in a Postman. And then once we have everything in a place, I want to go with my get task. And in here, what's the logic? Well, we could start by setting up async, of course, because we'll use the await. Then we'll go with our try catch block. And then I'll move this sucker up. And then first, we just want to get that ID out of the params. So, of course, you can write it the long way, but I always like to do the structuring first. So we'll go here with const ID. And then I always prefer giving it somewhat useful alias. Otherwise, you just end up with a bunch of IDs. And then once in a while, it's just confusing which ID is for what. So I'll say, grab me the ID, which is coming from the params, but use the alias of task ID from now on. And then I set it equal, of course, to rec.params. So it's the same object that I'm getting. And then, of course, we want to use that find one, correct? So we're going to go with const. This is going to be our document that we're getting back if we're successful. And we'll go with await, and then task, and then find one. And then, like I said, we pass in the object. And in this case, I'm going to be looking for underscore ID. So not the name, but underscore ID, which matches to that in the params. So I'll use here task and then ID. And If I'm successful, beautiful, we'll send back the task. If not, then we'll have to send back the 404 response. So in here, we'll go with res dot, and we're looking for status. So I'll say that everything is correct. We were successful. And therefore, we'll go with res dot status 200, then dot JSON, and then I just want to pass in a task. I'll say, yep, that's the task you're looking for. Now, there also might be a case where there's something wrong with an ID, where essentially, yes, we're getting the value from the params, but it doesn't match any of the tasks. And if you remember the documentation, then we get null. So what is the case then? Well, then I want to check if the task actually is null. And then, of course, I want to send back different response. Now, make sure that you always set up here return. Otherwise, what's going to happen? Well, JavaScript is going to be reading the code. And if you don't have the return, even though there might be no task, well, you'll send one response and then you'll send the next one right after that. So always make sure that you have return. So that way JavaScript knows, okay, so now I just need to return from the function. And in here we go with res.status. Now in this case though, of course, task that we're looking for doesn't exist. And the status code for that is 404. And then again, we go with JSON here and we'll pass in the message in the object, and the message will be following. We'll say no task with ID and then colon, and then we'll just look for task and then ID. And eventually, of course, we also might have the error. And I'll talk about these two errors in the next video, because that's going to be a common theme that we'll set up for the upcoming routes. And I kind of want to give it a separate video. So in here, let's just scroll up and let's just look for that generic one, the res.status 500, and then we'll just pass in the error. Copy this one and then scroll down, and below where we have the catch, of course, pass it in. So if I go back right now to my Postman, and if I click on send, I should get shake and bake, because of course that is the ID. Now, if you don't believe me, we can go back to all the tasks. Let's keep on scrolling. And then I think I'm going to be looking for this testing schema, because some of them are actually empty. When we were testing out, that's when we were setting them up. So now grab this ID instead, go back to single task, and then copy and paste. And of course, now the value is going to be testing schema. And like I mentioned previously, I'll talk about errors, why we have two of them, essentially, why we have two responses for the errors in the next video. But that's how we can set up a route to get a single item. So we go again with try catch, we set up async, and then we use the static function, find one. And then, of course, in this case, we're looking for the ID that has the value the same as in our params. If we can find one, awesome. We send back that specific task. If not, then we send back 404. And then all the way in a catch block, we have our generic error. Okay, so why do we have these two responses? Well, we have 404 with no task with this ID, and then we still have the generic one. Well, it's simply because we can have two types of errors. And in order to show you that, we just need to navigate back to the Postman, and then notice where we have the params, where I set up this long ID. Why don't we try changing the last value? So instead of B that I have here, I'm going to go with 0. And once we send, well, we should get the message, no task with blah, blah, blah ID. Why? Well, because of course, in our database, we don't have any item whose ID is matching. And I can clearly see the 404. That means that, of course, that is our response. But if we change this around, and then instead of keeping the same amount of characters, we start removing or adding, you'll see this error. And the name of this error is cast error. So effectively what's happening, if we have the correct syntax for the ID, but we cannot find the item, then of course we'll have to deal with it ourselves, because essentially there is no task with this ID. But if the ID is actually going to have the wrong syntax, meaning it's not going to match the amount of characters that Mongoose is looking for, then of course we'll get the error from the Mongoose. And like I already mentioned, this is going to be somewhat common setup for us for the upcoming controllers as well. Because for both of them, for update task as well as delete task, at the end of the day, we'll still have to find that one specific item. And if we're not successful, then we'll send back the 404, but we'll always have this generic one as well, just in case the actual syntax for the ID is totally off. Awesome. I think we're moving in nice pace. And up next, I'll actually work on delete task. Why? Well, because with update task, it's a bit more complicated. And I kind of want to leave it as the last one because I promised you that I'll show you the differences between put and patch as well. So therefore, let's work on delete. Now, most of the stuff is going to be exactly the same. So once you're comfortable with delete, I think you'll have no problem setting up update task as well. And just to showcase in our application, if we go back to all the tasks, if you click on removing the task, there you go. And of course, we just remove the task. And the setup is going to be very, very similar to getting the task. Of course, the biggest difference is going to be the method or the function that we're going to use. And in this case, we're looking for find one and delete. But everything else pretty much is going to be the same. So if you want, you can just copy and paste and change the values. But in my case, since it's going to be a bit more productive, why don't we type it out together? So I'll go with my async. We go with try catch block. Now I have simple res.send, so I'll just remove it altogether. Then we want to look for that ID in the params, because again, setup isn't going to be exactly the same, where we pass in the ID with our params, and we'll call this task ID. And that one is equal to rec.params. Then once we have access to the params, we just want to go with const task is equal to await, again, task, and then find one and remove, or I'm sorry, delete. So find one and delete. And in here, we want to pass in the ID again. So underscore ID, and that one is equal to our task and then ID. And then once we have the setup, of course, then we have two options. If such task exists, then we send back our 200. If the task doesn't exist, so essentially if this is equal to null, then of course we go with our 404. And in this case, I will speed this up a little bit where I'll grab the if condition like so. And then as far as the response, initially I'm going to go with a JSON object and I'll set task equal to task. But at the very end of the video, I'll discuss multiple options that we have. So this is the 404 if we're not successful. Again, if that item doesn't exist with that particular ID. If we are successful, we go with res dot and then status, and we pass in 200. And then we just go with JSON, and then we pass in the task. So essentially that way in the Postman, we'll be able to see which task we removed. And then just like the previous controllers, we'll grab our generic one as well and set it up in the catch one. So if there is an error, there's going to be a message property with that particular error. So we navigate back to the Postman and we're looking for delete task. Again, we have this dummy value. In my case, that is Peter, but in your case, it might be something else. So again, we need to go to GetAllTasks, run it. So now, of course, we can see all our tasks and then just pick whichever you want to remove. And you know what? In my case, I'm going to go for those empty ones first because I don't want them in my database anyway. So I'll go over here, I'll grab the ID, and then I'm looking for delete task, copy and paste. And then once I save, check it out. Now, of course, I can see that I removed this task. And I'll remove another dummy one as well. So let me run it one more time. Now I can clearly see that I have only one without a name since I removed the previous one. So let me just grab it over here and then back to delete task, copy and paste, and then send. And of course, I can clearly see that I removed this one as well. And just to showcase again why we have those two errors, let's go back to all the tasks. Let's send, and I'll grab the first one for shake and bake. And what you'll notice is that if I pass in the ID and if I just change the last value, so I still keep the same structure, then of course we'll get our 404. So no task with ID, and of course I have 404. Now, if I'll start adding or removing the items, then of course what you'll see is this error. So of course this is coming from our catch block. Hopefully that makes sense. And then lastly, I just want to mention that as far as this response, I purposely set it up here as a task just so we can see in the Postman, because I think it's a bit useful when we're setting up our first API. But by any means, you're not limited to sending this type of response. Why? Well, because usually when it comes to deleting a task, you're really not looking for the data here. Take a look at our front end. It really doesn't care what task we're actually removing, because the way the functionality works is I click on a button, then I'm looking for the response. And if the server sends back this 200, then right away on my front end, I go like, okay, awesome, I was successful. So let me fetch the entire list one more time. So it's not like I take that item and then I do something about it. No, I just say, I want to remove the item. If I'm successful, awesome, I'll do one thing. If I'm not successful, then of course I want to display some error message or something along those lines. Therefore, if you go back and if you change this around to, for example, and I'll just show you some common ones that you might see in the other APIs. So let me comment this one out. I'll copy and paste. And then as long as you go with 200, you can simply even go like this. You can say send. That's it. That's all you have to do. And the functionality will still work. Or you might see something like this where, again, copy and paste. And then if we go with JSON, and some people just go with task and then set it equal to null. And you might add a status property here with success. And as you can see, sky is the limit. I'm just showing you what type of responses you might get back, because again, the main idea is that if you're successful, if you're getting D200 already on a front end, you know what's happening. So most likely you're not going to be looking for that one specific item that you're deleting. But again, in my case, I just set up this task so we can nicely see in a Postman what we're removing. So I'll remove these two lines of code here, and then I'll just set it back to my JSON where I have task is equal to task. And as a quick side note, once we're done setting up the update task route, I'll spend an entire video on various options that you have for your responses. So just put the pin on that and we'll come back to it a bit later. All right, and we have successfully arrived at our last controller, the update task one. And if we are comfortable with getting the single task and setting up the delete task, we should be in good shape. Because yes, there's going to be a bit more functionality, because in this case, not only are we looking for the ID, but we'll also need the body, since of course we'll be updating something, correct? And then the second thing, we have to pass in some options, since by default, we won't get right away the validators working, and also we won't get the item that we just updated. And don't worry, of course, I'll talk about all of that in detail. So for now, just to stay consistent, I'll move this sucker down. I'll move it below the delete task. And let's just start simply by accessing both of the things. Let's get the params one and then the body one. So we just want to see that we are successful on acquiring both of those things. So I'll set this up as async. It's just a simple send, so I'll just remove it. And we're going to go with try catch. And for now, let's just go with res dot and then status. We'll set it equal to 200 and then the JSON one. And in here, I want to grab two things. I want to grab my ID, just double check that I'm getting it properly from the params, and also the body. So for now, above the res.status, let's set up the ID one more time. We'll say ID. So we're destructuring from the rec.params, rec.params. And second one is going to be rec.body. And if you want, you can assign it to a data or whatever. But in my case, I'm just gonna set up the property here and set it equal to directly. So let's just say ID is equal to a task ID, and then data is going to be equal to rec.body. Again, why are we going to be passing data? Well, because if we're updating something, of course, you need that new info, correct? So if I go back to my application and if I say that instead of walking the dog, I want to walk the cat, of course, I need to supply this name. Otherwise, it's not going to make any sense. The same goes for completed. I need to pass in that key with a new value. And in this case, of course, it's going to be false. So once I click edit, notice I'm successful. Awesome. So if I go back to all the tasks, now I have walk the cat. And in order to test this out, again, we need to go back to the Postman. We're looking for getting all the tasks since I want those correct IDs. And you can pick any of them. Doesn't really matter. I think I like the shake and bake the most. So take this one. Then we need to go to patch the update task one, copy and paste. And then in response, we should see the ID, correct? We're not going to see the data since we haven't set up anything here in our body, at least not right now, but we'll do it in a second. But of course, now we're just getting update task. So let's see. Let me go back here, update task. Probably I didn't save the file. My apologies. Let me run one more time. And now I should see the ID that matches, of course, my shake and bake. But as far as data, there's nothing there. Why? Well, because I haven't sent anything from my front end, right? So now let's go to the raw, and then we'll set it equal to the JSON. And then we set up our object. And remember, we're looking for the name. And I'll just say testing, edit functionality, I guess. And then we're going to be looking for completed. And we'll set it equal to, let's just double check. In here, it's true. So let's go with false. And let's set it here. Of course, now not only I'm getting the ID, just coming from the params, but I also have the data property. And in there, of course, I can clearly see those values. Again, the whole deal why I'm doing this is just so we don't have to console log on a server. And once we have all of this in place, now let's roll up our sleeves and actually set up our functionality. So I'll remove this one. We don't care about this one right now. And again, we want to go with the task, meaning I'll sign up a variable with the name of task, and I'll set it equal to await. And of course, now we're looking for task, the model name, and then find one. And if this one was find one and delete, what do you think is going to be this one? Well, it is find one and update. And in here, we need to pass in a few things. First, we need to pass in the object where, again, we set up our condition. So in this case, again, I'm going to go with ID matches to that one in the params. So underscore ID equal to task ID. That's step number one. Then, of course, we need to pass in that new data since we're updating something, correct? So let's go here with comma, and that's going to be the second value. So essentially, you need to set up the object and set up which properties you're updating. But remember, we are already getting that as far as rec.body. So rec.body is right away this object. So I can simply set up my next parameter like so, where I go with rec.body. And then we have options object. But I first want to show you what happens if we don't use it. And then we'll add both of the values in there as well. So let's start here again by checking the task, because again, we might have a situation where there is no task with that specific ID. And again, just to speed this up, I'll copy and paste. And then if we are successful, then of course I want to send back the task. I'll say task is equal to task. And don't forget the generic error where we go with the res.status. And then you already know the rest. Copy and paste. And you'll notice something interesting since we don't have the options. You'll notice the following thing where I go with testing edit function. Okay, that's awesome. I completed false. But essentially what we're going to get back is the original value. So remember the shake and bake? Effectively, this is what we'll get back. So once I send, notice, yeah, I get 200. So I was successful. But Notice the value here. It's shake and bake. And what's more interesting, that once I click on getting all the tasks, it's actually changed. So I was successful. So here's the gotcha. The reason why is that happening is because we're not passing in the options. And as far as the options, we want to do two things. We want to get the new one back because by default, we're getting the old one. That's why we were successful. But in our update response, we got the old value. And the second thing, what you'll notice is the fact that we're not running the validators. So if you remember, when we were setting up the model, one of the things that I set up for the name was required equal to true. Now, if I try to update item with name equal to an empty string, I'm actually going to be successful. Now, again, we're getting back the old value. And in order to check the new one, we just need to run GetAllTasks. Notice. And I promise you, I'll say this for the last time in this video. The reason for that is because we don't have the options object. And in order to set it up, we just need to go back to all the controllers. And like I said, third parameter is going to be our options. And then we simply go with new true. So this will always, always, always return that new item, the one that is already updated. And then the another property we can run is run validators, and we'll set it equal to true. So once we do that, of course, we fixed both bugs. So if I, for the final time, I guess in this video, go back to my Postman, and in here, I'm going to go back to shake and bake, and we'll set the value equal to true. We should see that right away. So I can see shake and bake. And if I try to do that without passing anything in the name, then of course I'll get my big fat error, because when I was setting up the model, I said that name is actually required. Awesome. And believe it or not, we're actually done with our basic setup as far as the API. And in order to showcase that, I'll simply go back to app.js, and then I want to serve my static files because this is where my app is sitting. And of course, since our API is up and running, we can simply set up those static files, the app, and the functionality should work. And if you remember, in order to serve static files, we need to use another middleware, and we're going to go with app.use. We'll pass in express, and the name is static. And then in here, we just simply need to say where the static files are located. And in our case, of course, that is in the public folder. And let me just say that if your code is exactly like mine, everything is going to work. Now, back in the app.js, I don't think we need that hello one anymore. So let me remove this one for the routes. I'll just leave the version 1 and then tasks. And then if I go to localhost 3000 and I remove that hello, I should see my app, and I can clearly see that these are all the tasks that I currently have. And if I want to add new one, I'm just going to say testing app. And once I add, of course, I have all the way in the bottom a testing app. Well, effectively, I have two, but we right away can also practice on deleting. So there it is. Now we can delete the items all the way to second task. Then if I want to see the single task, just click over here. Notice now I have the task ID as well as second task. And then eventually, if I want to edit, well, I just click here on completed and I'll say third task. Third task. And if everything is correct, we should see task edited. Now I still need to fix the CSS, but as long as you see the correct text, you should be in good shape. Now, of course, by the time you're watching this, I'll fix this. But the idea is following. If I try to edit the item without providing the name, now, of course, I'll get error. Please try again. I just need to fix the CSS where essentially, if I'm successful, I still get this red color. And then once I navigate back, now these are going to be my tasks. If you're interested in the actual app, just navigate to the public one. You'll see that I used vanilla.js just so everyone can be on the same page. And essentially, as far as the logic, you're looking for browser app.js. And I'm not going to show you the entire thing, but as far as submitting the new task, I'm just listening for submit event. Then I prevent the default. I'm looking for the value in the input. And notice that I'm using the Axios library. And check out the method. What is the method name? That is post. Why? Well, because that's how we can pass data onto the server, correct? Now, what is the URL? That should be familiar. We have API version 1, and then, of course, I'm looking for the tasks. And in here, I pass in the data. So unlike the Postman, where we were doing that manually, now, of course, I just grab the input and I'll pass it in. And if you remember, the completed was set to false right from the get-go. So I don't need to worry about that. I just need to pass in the name. And again, everything is in try catch. So if I'm successful, then of course, what happens? Well, then I add the correct alerts and all that. And then I just refetch one more time the tasks. Now, if I'm getting the error, then of course, I'll add different alerts and hopefully you get the gist. And just to lastly showcase the delete one, if we scroll up a little bit, notice the method here. And like I previously mentioned, the only thing I'm looking for here is the response. If everything is correct, if I have 200, awesome. I just refetch all the tasks. If not, then there's an error. And essentially, I don't remove it from my DOM. That's why I said that technically, when you're set up for the delete, in most cases, you're not going to have to send back that item that you're removing. And now it's simply about making this app better. Because yes, we have the core functionality in place. We can definitely test it out on the front end and everything is awesome. But there's some things that we would want to fix. For example, I want to remove all these try catch blocks. I don't want to repeat myself in such a way. I also want to set up one place where we're dealing with errors and other improvements. So in the following videos, we'll make our app better. So we have the core functionality in place. Now we just want to make it better. All right. And up next, I want to finally discuss put method versus patch method. So why in this API, in our routes, we used patch, and during tutorial, we used put. So here's the deal. Yes, put and patch are both for updating the resource, but the assumption is that when you use put, you're trying to replace the existing resource, and patch is for partial update. And since I'm fully aware that this might sound like mumbo jumbo to you, let me give you an example. So if we go to our Postman, and then more specifically, update task, if the ID is correct, then only the properties that I'll pass in will be updated. So in this case, if I'm going to go with shake and bake number 2, and I'll actually remove completed, only the property that is passed in will be updated. So if I send, check it out. Now I get the task and I can clearly see that completed is there, even though I didn't pass it. Why? Well, because that's how our functionality is set up in the controller. So if I'll pass completed and I'll set it equal to false, of course, it will be updated as well. So if I go here completed and I'll set it to false, yes. In this case, since I'm passing the property, of course, now I'm going to get the new result. Now, what is the difference with put? Well, let me go the long route and actually set up one more controller, but keep in mind that this is going to be just temporary controller. So if you don't want, you can just sit back and relax. And we'll start in our routes, where essentially I want to go with my route. And in this case, I'm still looking for this / and then :ID, because again, the functionality is going to be almost the same, but I'm looking for a different method and I'm looking for put. And of course, now we just need to create the controller. And in my case, eventually I'll call this edit task, just so it's a little bit different. So of course, I'm not exporting that yet, but I'll right away set it here in my structure. I'll say edit task, and then back in the controllers, I just want to go below the update task. Again, this is just going to be temporary, but I'll go with const edit and then task, and that one is going to be equal to whatever I have over here. we simply need to add one more option in the find one and update. So let me select this whole thing just so we don't have to type it from the scratch. And all the way in the bottom, we're going to go with edit task. And like I said, it's going to be temporary. So in here, I'm not going to save it with all my routes, but let me just save my current ones and I'll close all of these windows and let's set up a new route. So in this case, it's going to be a put route. And remember, we have our variable. So I'm looking for URL, and then I'm looking for the tasks. And of course, I want to grab some kind of ID. So let me get, again, all the tasks here. And I'm going to stick with shake and bake because I like that name so much. So let me grab this ID here. Then back in tasks, we'll pass it in. And then let's try to recreate the same functionality that we have for now in the patch. And essentially, what I really want is just to pass in some data in my body. So I'm going to go here with raw. Again, we're looking for JSON. And we'll set it up name equal to John. Nothing particularly original. And once I save, of course, now shake and bake has the name of John. But here comes the biggest difference between put method that we're using over here and the patch method. So idea with put is that if I send only the name, my expectation is that all the rest of the properties, which of course in our case is just completed, will be removed from that item. So we will replace that item. And how is that going to look like in our controller? Well, here everything is going to be exactly the same, but by default, Mongoose doesn't do that. So by default, Mongoose is going to be like, okay, so you want to get the item, you want to update it, awesome. Just get me the properties you want to update, and the rest of them will stay the same. And if I actually want to remove those properties, the ones that I'm not passing in with my request, I need to add another option here, and the option name is override, and we need to set it equal to true. So now you'll notice that back in my Postman, if I send here with name and let's just keep it interesting and pass in Peter, check it out. We have name and the completer is still there. Now, why it's still there? Well, because in our model, we have default set to false. So there is some default one. If I remove it, you'll notice that with our put method, the way the controller works right now, if I send it right now, then of course, I'll just get the name. So completed is not there anymore. So if I take a look at all the tasks now, in the first one, actually completed is missing. So that is going to be the difference. Where when we work with put, the expectation is that we'll replace the item. So we'll just pass in the properties that we want to set up in item, and then the rest of them effectively will be removed. But when we're working with patch, we're just updating the properties that we're passing in. Just remember that in real life, you will see the APIs where the put method is used with the same functionality as the patch. Now, in our case, for the remainder of the project, we'll use the patch one instead. So therefore, I'll remove this edit one and here as well. And the same I want to do in routes. Like I said, this is just for demonstration purposes. So save it here. And I also want to remove this route from my Postman just so it's not in the way. So say don't save. And I'm back to my 5 routes. And of course, for the update, I'm using the patch one. And before we start refactoring our code and adding some extra middleware, let's just spend a few minutes on our responses. And more specifically on the other options you have when setting them up. And I'll use GetAllTasks route as my example. Just keep in mind that the same goes for the rest of them. And essentially, when I was setting up the route, I said that you have tons of options here as far as the response. So in my case, I'm just setting up, of course, the JSON object, and then I set the property tasks equal to tasks. But you can also do something like this, where I'll copy and paste, and I'm going to go with res.status. So this won't change. We're just talking about the object that we're sending back. And instead of simply just sending tasks, you could also add the amount of tasks. And for this property name, of course, sky is the limit. Whatever you want to come up with. In my case, I'm going to go with amount, but you can also call it maybe value, maybe the number of hits, or something along those lines. And here you're just looking for tasks and, of course, the length, like so. And also, what we could do, and I'll just comment these options out just so they can stay for your reference. And let me copy and paste so I don't have to type res.status. Also, what we could do, well, I could set up a flag here where I say success is equal to true. And then, of course, we need to keep in mind if that is the case, then you also need to add something here where you have the error, whether that is 404 error or it's the general 501. So effectively, here I just add this extra bit of data where I say, yeah, the success was true. And then you can even place it in the data property and then say tasks is equal to tasks and also maybe add the amount. So that's also something that you might see around. For example, the Hacker News API uses the number of hits like so. Essentially, you just get that value. And again, that is going to be equal to the array that you're getting back equal to a length. And once I save, of course, my response is going to look like this. Now, if you don't like the success one, you can go maybe with status. That's also something that you might see around where we set up status is equal to success for the successful responses. And then for the errors, of course, we're going to go with status and then fail or error or whatever string value you might want to set up. And if you're wondering why am I showing you this, is because I want you to be aware of your options. So just because I'm setting it this way, where I just pass in the tasks, of course, that's not a rule. That's pretty much my preference. And why I don't prefer setting up the statuses or successes or the data here, that is simply because of the front end. So in my experience, when we use front end, there's two things that are going on. Effectively, when we have asynchronous responses, we already have try and catch. And because of that, I find the status or success to be a bit redundant. Because effectively, just like I showed you with delete, if I'm successful, then of course this code will run regardless. And then if there's some kind of error, then of course I'm going to have my code in the catch block. And why I don't like setting up the data? Well, because on my front end, usually I use Axios. And if you're familiar with Axios, it right away returns a data property. So it right away has that data object. So if you set this response in such a manner where you have data returned in the object, then on the front end, you'll have data. And then in that data object, you have another data. So essentially on the front end, you would need to do something like this, where there is a data object. Inside of that data object, there's another data object, and then you only get the tasks, which is, of course, not the end of the world. But in my case, again, I find it a bit redundant. And lastly, when it comes to tutorials and courses, I also enjoy the fact that there's less typing in the setup, where I just pass in the tasks. So be aware of your options. My suggestion is whichever route you pick, just stick throughout the API so there's no confusion. Don't set up one type of response for one route and then go totally different in a different route. That's going to be very confusing to whomever is using your API. And lastly, let me just say this. Yes, you can set up your own API responses however you like. But if you want our front-end app, the one that's sitting in the public, to work properly, the responses have to be exactly the same as mine because that's what the app is expecting. If you'll set it up willy-nilly, then you might get some bugs. Not bad, not bad. Once we have discussed our response options, next I want to work on a route not found. So at the moment, life is awesome. We have our application. Everything works. If I go to index.html, of course, I can see the application. If I go to API, then version 1 and then tasks, of course, I can see all the tasks. But what happens if I go with API version 1 and then hello? So I have cannot get API blah blah blah. And I can clearly see in my browser that, of course, we get 404 error, but essentially this is going to be the default one. And instead, I want to set up the custom one, just like they have in Algolia one, or again, if you're looking for some kind of resource and the server can't find the resource, then essentially we still get the 404, but of course, the value here is unknown. Now, it doesn't really matter what you set up as far as the value. Just want to showcase how we can set up a custom 404 response. And the way we do that, we go back to our application here. And then in the app.js, I want to remove these comments because I think we're clear on the REST API. And the location here is very important. So we have the middleware for public and JSON. That still stays the same. Then we have all our routes for the tasks. And then right after that, we want to go with app.use. And then we'll pass in our middleware function, the one that will handle the 404 and send some kind of custom response. Now we haven't created it yet. So let's go back to our starter. We'll create a new folder because there's going to be a few middlewares that we'll set up in the upcoming videos. So I'll say middleware. And then inside of the middleware, we want to go with new file. And I'll call this one, not surprisingly, not found and a JS. And as far as the logic, well, we'll still have access to rec and res. So we just need to come up with function name. In my case, it's going to be not found, and I'll set it equal to rec and res. And then as far as the response, I'm just going to go with res dot, then status. And of course, in this case, it's 404. So the server is letting the user know that it cannot find the resource. And then as far as the message, I'll just use the simple send. And I'll say route does not and exist. So now, of course, we just need to export this. And we do that with module, then exports, of course. And we'll set it equal to our not found. And then back in the app.js, above the app.use, I guess, we're going to go with const not found is equal to require. Then we're looking, of course, in our middleware. So let me say dot middleware, and then more specifically, we're looking in the not found, and then in the app.use, we'll just stick not found one. And once we save, and in this case, I'll just use the Postman, just so you can see that it's going to work exactly the same. And if we're looking for the URL, and then we'll go with hello, now of course we have our custom one. We have route does not exist, which is pretty awesome. And just to showcase that, it's going to be the same scenario in the browser as well. Notice once we refresh, we have route does not exist. So we set up the middleware folder. In there, we have not found JS, and then back in the app.js, we import the function. We set some kind of name. In my case, it's not found. And then all the way in the bottom, we go with app.use and we pass in the function. And in that function, we'll have access to rec and res. And in our case, we're just interested in the response, and we'll set up a 404 with whatever message we want to send back. Awesome. And up next, I want to work on asynchronous wrappers for all our controllers. Why? Well, because we have asynchronous operations. And yes, it's very useful to use these try-catch blocks, but you'll have to agree with me that it becomes somewhat redundant. Pretty much for every controller, setting up try and then catch. And as you can see, essentially, I'm just copying, pasting the code around. So there has to be a better solution. And that better solution is to create a middleware function that essentially will wrap our controllers. And in there, we'll just set up the functionality where we don't have to repeat ourselves. And before we continue, let me just say that there are some NPM packages that do that for us. And most likely in the upcoming project, we'll use them instead, since that way we can save some time on the setup. But I think it's very important to have at least a general idea of what the package is doing instead of blindly installing it. And therefore, in our first project, we'll set up the basic logic ourselves. And we'll start over here with new file, and I'll call this async.js. And then inside of it, I'm just going to go with const async wrapper. So I simply create a function. At the moment, nothing's happening here. And then I want to export it. So module exports, and then async wrapper. And once we set up the export, now, of course, I just want to go to my controllers and import that middleware. So I'm looking in the middleware, and I'm looking for async. So in here, let's just call this async wrapper again, and that is equal to require. Then we navigate to our middleware folder, and of course, we're looking for the async. And now what we want to do is wrap all of our controllers. Now, I'm not going to wrap all of them right away. I'll just start with GetAllTasks, just so you understand how it is going to work. So what we want to do here is just to take this async wrapper, this function, and just wrap our current controller. And essentially it's going to look like this, where we go with async wrapper, and we pass in the controller, the current controller, as an argument. And since we know that we can do that in JavaScript, we are in good shape. So we pass it in, and then back in the async, of course, I need to set up the parameter. So since I'm passing in already in the controllers, my function, my controller as an argument back in my async.js, my middleware, I just need to go with some kind of parameter. Now you can call this callback, you can call this function, doesn't really matter. In my case, I'm just going to go with fn. And what am I trying to do here? Well, I'm trying to avoid this try catch. So essentially, I want to have my cake and eat it too, where I can still use this nice await syntax, but I don't have to set up these try catch blocks. How can we do that? Well, we set up the try catch blocks inside of the wrapper. And the first thing that I want to do from this function is to return another one. So in here, I'll say return async. And then if you remember in the express, by default, we right away got request, response, as well as the next. So that's what I'm trying to do over here. Since I wrapped my controller in my middleware, and if you pay close attention, we're actually invoking the async wrapper right away. Now, of course, I want to pass in those request, response, and next down to my function, down to this controller, correct? Because now, of course, I wrap my controller in my middleware. And the way we do that, we return another function since I'll use await inside of the function body. That's why I set it up here as async. And please, please, please keep something in mind where these ones, the rec, res, and next, will have access to right away, because at the end of the day, we return another function from async wrapper. And then inside of the function body, one of the things that I want to do is pass these rec, res, and next from express down to this function. So hopefully that is clear. Again, we get these ones by default. The reason why we have access to them, because from our async wrapper, we actually return another function. So that's how we'll have right away access to them. And then in the function body, we'll decide what to do with our parameter, with our argument, which is our current controller. And as far as the logic, I want to go with try catch block. And then inside of the try block, I'm going to go with await and function. And here we'll pass in rec, res, and next. And then once we have passed all of these things down to our controller, of course, now we'll have access to them in here as well. And then also, since there might be a case for an error, we'll go with next, and then we'll pass in the error. And if you're wondering what's happening over here, essentially we're passing this to a next middleware, which we haven't set up yet in our app.js. So that's what's coming up in the following videos. We'll set up another set of middleware, and in this case, we'll deal with errors. So once we save over here, we can go back to the controllers, and now I can remove the try catch block. So remove the try catch block completely. And at this point, you should only have these two lines of code where we're waiting to find all the tasks. And if we're successful, we send back those tasks. And as far as the async wrapper, we take our controller as a argument. And then since we return a function, we have access to rec, res, and next that are coming from the express. And we set up the try catch block. And in here we have await because our controller is still async. And we know that by default, a sync function will always return a promise. So in here, I just have await, and I'm waiting for that promise to be settled, either resolved or rejected. And since my controller will still need to access rec, res, and possibly next, since I get them from express, I pass it down to my controller. And then if there is an error, so in here, if we trigger some kind of error, whether in GetAllTasks or any of the controllers, then of course we'll catch it over here and we'll pass it to a next set of middleware, which we haven't set up yet. And now, of course, once we have everything in place, now we just want to apply these changes to all the routes. Now, I fully understand that some people are very negative about refactoring the code. And to some degree, I sympathize with that because I also hold the opinion where it's not very useful if we're all the time refactoring the application. But it was important for me to show you the long way first, because that way you have a good understanding of how everything works. And now we just set up the middleware that actually handles that. So let's go back to the controllers and slowly but surely, let's add this async wrapper to all the routes. And the setup is going to be following for all of them, where we start with async wrapper. So we set up our two parentheses here, and we need to make sure that the second parenthesis, the closing one, is right after the curly brace, correct? Then we want to remove the try block as well as the catch block. And again, we'll be just left with await, task.create. If we're successful, we send back the task. And effectively, we want to do that for all our controllers. So let me go here with async wrapper, same deal, wrap this guy here, and then we have try, and we remove the catch, but we are leaving this one. So we'll work with this one a little bit later. For time being, we'll leave it as it is with this response. And once we set up our custom error, there's going to be some changes here as well. Let's keep on scrolling. We're looking for the async wrapper. And again, we want to add the closing one right after the curly brace. We still pass in the function. I'll remove my try. I'll remove my catch here. And we'll save it. And the same goes for updating the task as well. So we go here with async wrapper. And we'll close it. Then we want to remove try. And we want to remove catch. And just to try it out, why don't we go to create task? And then I'm just going to go with creating task. Let's try it out. Everything still works. I can create my task. But if I'll try to add a task with an empty string value, I should get the error. And I do. But of course, this is not the error that we're sending. So that's something that we're going to work on in the upcoming videos. And once we have set up the async wrapper, next I want to work on catching the errors. And we're going to start our journey actually in the Express documentation. So go to express.js.com and then in search box, just type error. And first, let's take a look at the default one. And if you take a look at the first sentence, Express comes with built-in error handler that takes care of any errors that might be encountered in the app. This default error handling middleware function is added at the end of the middleware function stack. And if we pass in error to the next and you do not handle it in a custom error handler, it will be handled by the built-in one. Why am I telling you this? Well, because that answers this question. Where is this response coming from? Well, that is coming from the default built-in error handler. That's point number one I want to make. Otherwise, you might be wondering, well, where are we getting this info? Second, next, correct? That's why in the async wrapper, we set up this next and error. So we passed it to the next middleware, but in our case, of course, we haven't set up that handler yet. So therefore, it was just eventually passed down to the built-in one. And lastly, if we go back and if we say here error, so I'll search one more time. And in this case, we're looking for writing error handlers. So this is what we're about to do. We'll set up another set of middleware. However, in this case, the middleware will handle errors. And you can see that if we want to handle errors, we just pass in 4 arguments. And then the first one will be that error. And then we want to place that at the very end of our routes. So let's just navigate back. And of course, in the example, they showcase how they right away set up the middleware in the app.js. In our case, since we'll have more code, essentially, I want to create another file in the middleware. So in here, I'm just looking for new file, and I'll call this error and then handler. And inside of the file, I just need to come up with the function, and I'm going to go the long route where I'll say error handler middleware, and that is equal to error. Again, in this case, we need to have 4 parameters: request, response, and we also have next. And as far as the logic, we'll add more code once we set up our own custom error class. But for time being, we just want to go with return and res.status. And if you remember, that's exactly what we had previously in the try catch block. And I'm just going to go with 500 and we'll say JSON error, and error is equal to error. Now, if you want, you can console log it, of course, but the result is going to be exactly the same, where in here, we'll have access to that error, the one that is going to be coming, in our case, from this async wrapper. And then we just need to decide what we want to do. And I'll just start by setting error equal to error. And you know what? Actually, I want to go with message is equal to error. And now we simply want to go back to app.js where we have not found. Let's just copy and paste. And now we just need to come up with a name. And as you know, naming is probably the hardest thing in programming. So in my case, I'm just going to call this error handler and then middleware. And of course, that one is coming from the file that we just set up, the error handler. And then we want to scroll all the way down. And right after not found, we're going to go with app.use. And of course, we'll pass in the error handler middleware. And once we save and we go back to the Postman and try to send the same request, meaning the request with a incomplete data, then we should get a different response, but we don't. Effectively, it looks like I have a bug. So let me check the error handler. And yes, of course, I didn't export the function. So let me go with module, exports, and that one is equal to a error handler one. And of course, if I test it out right now, I should see the custom response. And we can clearly see that because we have the message. Now, like I already mentioned previously, if you don't like these big, massive error messages, you can simply go back over here. And instead of setting the message equal to an error, you can just hard code some kind of message. So you can go something along the lines of something went wrong, comma, try again later. This is what we'll see in Postman. Again, we send, and now, of course, our message is shorter. So essentially, this is how we can set up a custom error handler in Express, where we add another piece of middleware, and then in there we have 4 arguments, and the first one is going to be the error. And of course, in our case, the way we pass the errors down to this custom error handler is by using the async wrapper. And in there we have the next. So as you remember from tutorial, with next, we pass it to the next middleware. And previously we used the built-in default one. And now, of course, we have our own, where effectively you can set up whatever logic you want. If you want to send this as 200, nothing stops you from doing that. But of course, a more meaningful response would be with some kind of error code and with some kind of meaningful message, whether that is hard-coded string or you can pass in the entire error object. And right after we set up our custom error handler, let's work on our 404 responses too. And essentially, I want to set up a custom error class, which extends from the general JavaScript error class And that way we can handle all of our 404 responses in our newly created error handler as well. And we're going to start by navigating back to the controllers, and the routes or controllers that I'm looking for are following. I want to work on update task. Here we send the 404, then the same is for deleting the task, and of course, getting the task. And let's just start over here with getting the task. And simply I want to showcase that we can create a new error object if we run the built-in JavaScript error constructor. And we go here with const, and no surprise, I'm going to call this error, and that is equal to new. And then we just go with error. And here we pass in the message. So I can say not found. And then in the next line, I'm just going to go with error. So now I'm dealing with the object that I just created, and I'll set another property on it, and I'll say status. So that's the name of the property. And of course, the value will be 404. So now, if you want, you can console log it here, or what we can simply do is use next and pass this guy down to our custom error handler. Remember, that's how it works. We call next, and then we pass in the error. And of course, in this case, we are creating that error ourselves instead of getting it from the Mongoose. And the only thing that's missing right now is in our controller, because we don't have the next. So I want to go here with next, and then we need to go with return again. I already mentioned why we want to do that, because we don't want JavaScript to keep reading the code. Now, of course, we have this one right now, but hopefully you get the gist where we need to go with return and then next. And now, of course, I want to pass in my newly created error object. And once I do that, if we go back over here in the error handler, and if we simply console log, we should see our newly created error object. So I'm going to go here with console log, and I'll look for my error. And now let me go back to the Postman. And essentially what I want to do, I want to get all the tasks, and then I'll look for one of the IDs. But again, I don't want to get that cast error. So I still want to keep the same structure. I just want to pass in the wrong value. So I'll look for single task. I'll copy and paste. And then instead of 3, I'm going to go with 4. So once we send, of course, we get our custom error message, as vague as it currently is. And then, of course, in the console, I can clearly see that I have not found. So, of course, that is going to be my message. And I understand that might be a bit confusing, but effectively the idea is following, where once we create this new error object, that property is going to be on there. So in order to access the string value, we'll have to go over here and simply go with error and then dot message. And as far as the status, well, we can clearly see it here. We can have 404. So now, just for kicks, what we can do is set up message is equal to error message. Like I said, there's the property on that object. And then as far as the status, well, I can simply change this one around, where instead of 500, I'll pass in error and then status. And don't worry, of course, there's more code coming. And once I have applied these changes, of course, we can swing back to our Postman and check it out. Now, of course, we have 404, and then the message is not found. So that's pretty cool. Now, of course, we just need to go back to the tasks and set it up in such a way where we don't have to do this all the time manually. And the idea is following, where again, we'll create a new class, a new custom error class, and we'll extend it from the JavaScript error. And then we'll create a new instance and yada, yada, yada. And effectively, the way we want to do that, we want to create a new folder, and I'll call this errors. Pretty self-explanatory. So we're going to go here with new folders, and we're going to go with errors. And inside of it, I'm going to create another new file. And in this case, I'm going to call this custom and -error. And of course, I'm going to add the JS extension. And then inside of my custom error, now I want to extend from the error class. Now, here's the deal. In this case, I'll just write out the code, and then I'll go line by line of what's happening, because I think that's going to be a bit more productive. So let's go here with class, and then we just need to come up with a name. In my case, I'm going to go with the long one. I'm going to say custom API and then error. Now we need to use the extends keyword. And since I want to extend from the error class, I'm going to go here with error. And as far as the functionality, we want to go with constructor. And in here, we'll pass in message and status code. And then inside of the constructor, we want to call super, then pass in the message. And right after I call super, I'm going to go with this dot status code. And I'll set that one equal to whatever I'm passing in the constructor. So in here, I'll pass in the status code. And as far as these few lines of code, a constructor method is a special method we invoke when we create a new instance of a class. And in our case, we'll pass in two arguments, an error message and a status code. Then, since we're extending, basically, we're setting up a child class, we need to call super method, which in turn invokes a constructor of a parent class. And in our case, we pass in our message value. As a result, we'll have access to all the methods and properties of the parent. So in our instance, we'll have the message property. And with this dot status code, we create a status code property as well. And that's how we can create our new custom error class. And essentially, if you want to create new instances, you can simply go with custom and then API error and then pass in those two values, the message and status code. But I actually like to set up a new function that does that for me. And here I'm going to go with const create custom and error. And this function is going to be looking for two parameters, a message and then a status code. And what I'm going to do is from this function, I'm going to return that new instance. So I'm going to go with return new, and then we're looking for custom API error. And then, of course, we'll pass in the message here as well as the status code. Now, of course, if you want to keep the same parameter names, you can definitely do so. But in my case, I'm purposely setting this up so you can see that this is coming from the function as far as the message. And of course, I pass into my custom API error, more specifically in the constructor as a message. And then, of course, we just need to export this, and we'll have to export both of them. And you'll see in a second why. So we're going to go with module exports is equal to an object, and then we're looking for create custom error and then custom API error. And once we have both, once we have the class as well as the function, and we're exporting both, now, of course, we want to go to the tasks. We just need to remember that, of course, we're exporting object. So therefore, we'll have to provide a specific name. In our case, I'm looking here for the function. So I'm going to go with const. I'll set up my curlies and I'll say create and then custom and error. So of course, that is my function. Set it equal to require. I do need to go 2 levels up. So in here, we're looking for the errors. And then more specifically, I'm looking for the custom one. And then I want to replace all of these 3 instances. And of course, I want to remove this manual code as well. So start over here. And then I'll keep this one for the second, just because I want to reuse the same message. And the idea is following, where we go with return, then next. And then instead of the next, we pass in create custom error. And of course, we want to pass in the message. So that's why I'll just copy this one, just because I want to speed this up. And then the second thing is going to be my status code, which of course is going to be 404. And now we can remove the second line. And we just want to copy and paste. So it's the same deal over here. And the same in the update task as well. And once we have all of this in place, now we just want to go to error handler. So our custom error handler, and instead of looking for the function, we're looking for the class. Because in here, I want to check if the instance is equal to our custom error one. Then, of course, I'll pass in the status code and the error message. However, if there is any other error, then, of course, we'll just go with res.status 500 and whatever we had before. So let me go at the top, and I'm going to go with const. Again, it is named the import. So we're looking for custom API and then error, and that is equal to require. And same deal. we go 2 levels up. We're looking for errors and more specific custom error. And let's right away set up the default one. And this one, I'll set it back to 500 here. And then as far as the JSON, let's go with the same message. I'm just going to say something went wrong. Please try again. And above this return, we're going to go with if, and then we'll check if the error is the instance of our custom API error. Then, of course, I want to go with return, and I want to pass in the res.status, and then that will be equal to a error dot status code, because of course that's where the value is sitting in that property. And then when it comes to the actual message, same deal. I'm going to go with message, and this will be equal to error. And then we're looking for the message property. And once we save, let's go and test it out. Or essentially, if I send it here from the Postman, of course, I'll have no task with this ID. And if I'm going to mess with the syntax, I should get the cast error, which of course I do because I can clearly see that something went wrong. Please try again. Lastly, let me just repeat one more time that error handling and validation is something we're going to return to later, most likely in a separate project. This is just a general setup just to get you comfortable with overall ideas. And later, we'll work on more complex validation and error handling approach. Nice. I think we're done with error handling, at least for now. And now let's talk about deployment. And right off the bat, I want to say that we're not going to deploy this project simply because we have not covered authentication yet, as well as extra packages for security, and deploying the project where anyone can tinker with all the data is somewhat irresponsible. And it actually can lead to a lot of headaches. But with that said, there is something deployment related I want to cover, and that is our port variable. You see, hard-coded value like port 3000 or 6000 or 7000 is decent solution in our local environment. But when it comes to deployment in many environments, the host, so the platform where the project is hosted on, may want to independently set the port value to whatever makes sense to the platform. Because as you can imagine, it needs to handle more than just one application at a time. And in order to make that possible, when it comes to port value, instead of hard coding to 3000, 6000, or whatever, we'll have to use the port variable that is available in process.env instead, and set up or operator just in case it's undefined. And in order to set that up, we need to go to our port variable. That's why in this case we set it up as a variable. And then before the 3000, we actually want to go with process and then .env, and then we're looking for the port variable. So we go here with port, and then if it is set, then of course we'll use that value. If not, then we'll use the OR operator, and then of course we're gonna go with 3000. Now, of course, in a local environment, by default, it's not gonna be set, so we'll always go back to the 3000. However, once we deploy, it's gonna be a different scenario. Now, if you want to test it out in a local environment, you can actually do so. And we do that by stopping the server. And then we want to go with a port. And we set it equal to whatever value you want. Now, in my case, I'm not going to go with 5000 because I believe my final one is using that. So I'm going to go with 6000. And then you want to go with a node. And then what is the name of the file you want to run? Of course, it is app.js. And now check it out. In a console, we should see 6000. Now, of course, I still see 3000 because I didn't save the file. My apologies. Let me stop the server just so you don't think that I'm messing with you. And let me run the command one more time. And now, of course, in the console, I can see server is listening on port 6000. And one more time, as far as our logic, we just say set port to whatever is the environment variable by the name of port, or 3000 if there's nothing there. Awesome. Congrats on completing the project, and I'll see you in the next one.